For the presenters and the panelists, you do have access, of course, to your cameras and your microphones. I ask that you all keep the microphones and the cameras off unless you are presenting, just to save our bandwidth and make sure that everyone can connect smoothly. So when it is your turn to present, just unmute yourself and turn on your camera. And as you'll see, the presentation will be in the main part of the screen, and then your camera will be visible in that thumbnail panel at the top. We have a few sessions to begin, and then we will have a short coffee break at 2 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. So just to kind of schedule your time out, that will be the first and actually only break. And I think, actually, I'd like to, without further ado, to get started. So to begin, we're going to have an opening session with Mr. Shantanu Mukherjee. Nadine, if you can move to the next slide. Mr. Shantanu Mukherjee is the Chief of the Integrated Policy Analysis Branch for SDGs at DESA, and he'll provide welcoming remarks, and then he will pass the floor on to Ms. Marianne Barthelemy, who is the Director of the Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination for Sustainable Development at UNDESA, and she will give us an update on the ministerial declaration and how it links up with the 2020 targets that are under review and are due to mature in 2020. So she will give us an update on how the member states are approaching that, and then we'll move on to the first session. So Shantanu, I'd like to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everybody for joining us at this important event. Very good afternoon or good evening to you, as the case may be. I'd also like to already specially welcome my colleague Marion, who has taken time out of the busyness of the day before DHLPF to actually join us here. So thank you very much for that, Marion. Now, we're meeting here today, friends and colleagues, to talk about these 21 targets with the 2020 approach date, maturation date. And these are very diverse, but as I was looking at them, it also struck me as how much they are really a microcosm of the entire 2030 agenda. We see within this group of 21 targets, similarities in how the rest of the agenda is progressing. There is uneven progress. A few are on track to be achieved, and here the focus is moving now actually from quantity to quality issues. Many more are unlikely to be achieved without additional effort, and there are, of course, the set of targets that are persistently not even headed in the right direction, a lot of them to do with nature. But we are all meeting here today in the shadow of the pandemic, and going beyond these similarities in statistics and trends, I thought it would be a good idea if I could extend this idea, this notion of the 2030 targets being a microcosm of the 2030 agenda a little bit further. And to that extent, I'd like to make 3 quick points for you to consider. The first point is that, as we are seeing with many other targets, achieving the SDGs themselves is a kind of policy vaccine, as some have called it, against the worst effects of the pandemic. So as with other targets related to availability of water for hand washing, or with the reduction in non-communicable diseases, which increase the risk of deadly outcomes if you do catch COVID-19, we see here too that achieving targets such as ICT access or maintaining intact forest cover, which reduces the risk of zoonotic diseases. Things like this, which may appear to be less well connected to the current pandemic, are actually also strong insurance policy against the worst effects of the pandemic. And we can expect this to be a recurrent theme as we build forward into the future as well. The second point I would like to make here is that, again, in this little group of 21 targets, we would expect to see perhaps a temporary improvement in some indicators, for example, related to road safety. People are simply not going around enough or driving around enough for fatalities to happen. But This temporary reprieve should not blind us to the fact that there is a need for greater structural shifts. Without those shifts, just as in the case of greenhouse gas emissions, which may fall temporarily now, we can expect a rebound back to the business as usual pathway where the trade-offs are not really considered in terms of accelerating progress on certain SDGs. We do have an opportunity here, though, as countries and economies rebuild and hopefully expand sectors that are more related to providing services, essential services, expand in areas of green growth. And perhaps that would be an opportunity as well for this set of targets to think creatively about how such an expansion could actually move away from the pre-pandemic pathway onto one that promotes sustainable development in a much more holistic and unified way. And the final point I would like to make, which is related to the post-pandemic pathway we want to be on, many of the targets that we will talk about today have been considered and arisen from dedicated member state processes based on robust science and specialized knowledge. But to achieve them, we need a greater mobilization that goes beyond the usual set of actors, mobilization across disciplines and stakeholders. In fact, the Global Sustainable Development Report from last year actually pointed out 4 levers for action, which included mobilization not just of finance and governance, but also of science and technology, and also raise the potential of individual and collective action to achieve these transformative pathways that we are talking about. So I hope our event today plays some small part in connecting across stakeholders and across different sets of actors who are actually all in this game together now. And it helps motivate and inspire some of the joint action that we need to make progress, not just on the 2020 targets, but across the whole spectrum of the SDGs. So with these few words, it is my pleasure to invite Marion to take the floor and give us a little update on how the ministerial declaration is going. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you, Shantanu, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar, which is really very timely. What I wanted to do is first to quickly recall why we have those 2020 targets in the 2030 agenda. Then I will talk about where member states are in their thinking about the targets. Then I'll quickly mention 2-3 options that we can think about. So first, why do we have those 2020 targets? Basically, it's because when the 2030 agenda was negotiated, the feeling was that there were those targets that were already agreed in other processes with end date of 2020, and you couldn't just move those targets to 2030 because that would have lowered the level of ambition. We have 20 of those targets in the agenda, and there are 3 with the date of 2025. What we know from the SDG Progress Report is that those targets have not been achieved. Another thing we know, you all know that there are indicators related to those targets. And an important development this year was that the Statistical Commission decided to keep monitoring and reporting on these indicators related to the 2020 targets. Second, on the member states' positions. So what we see in the ongoing negotiations is the member states are very aware of these 2020 targets, and they realize that it's important to discuss what to do about them. We can see it in the fact that tomorrow morning in the first session of the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, the 2020 targets are one of the issues that needs to be discussed. In the draft ministerial declaration of the High-Level Political Forum, there is also a paragraph on the 2020 targets. It speaks about the urgency of realizing them. And the proposal is that the General Assembly should ensure that all 2020 targets are reviewed and updated where needed. And that would be a call to the relevant intergovernmental or other processes. But there is no agreement on this way forward. Some countries even think the GA should look at all the targets and update them. And others think that most of the targets have their own process that is ongoing, and that we should leave those processes run their course. What is clear is that many countries do not want to reopen the 2030 agenda to update the targets because they fear it would lead to reopening other parts of the 2030 agenda. Third, on the options on the way forward, and here I don't want to prejudge, what will come out of the ministerial declaration and later, but there are some options, and they were presented to a meeting of the Friends of Governance last November by Felix Dodds, Jamie Bartram, and Gaston Ocampo. First, I think that the decision of the Statistical Commission to keep reviewing the indicators on those targets is actually a good decision, because I don't believe that anyone wants to just forget those targets. They are very important for the realization of the 2030 agenda. However, what is true is that a large number of those targets are being addressed in an ongoing process, such as on biodiversity, and that those processes, they will probably come up with new targets, which will most likely be more ambitious than the current ones. So the question is, how can we include those more ambitious targets into the implementation of the 2030 agenda without reopening the agenda? So a possible approach would be that when those processes are done, the General Assembly or the HLPF recognize their outcomes and encourage the countries to also take into account the new targets when they implement the 2030 agenda. Of course, there is the issue of the orphan targets that do not have a process of review at the moment, such as on youth unemployment, for example, or scholarships. But those could be reviewed by the organizations in those areas like ILO or UNESCO. So I will stop here. I mean, there are no easy answers to how we will deal with those targets, and this is why your webinar is very timely, and I see the participants are very relevant to discuss those issues, and I very much look forward to your ideas and the possible way forward. And my colleague Irena Zubcevic is also online from my division, who did a lot of work on this issue. Thank you, Shantanu.
Thank you so much, Marion. Stephanie, it's over to you now.
Thank you so much, Shantanu and Marion, for those excellent stage-setting remarks. We're going to keep very close watch on the clock, so I'm going to move on now to session one. And just two housekeeping things that I didn't mention before. One, as I said, we are going to keep a close eye on the time, and so I've made a sign so that when your presentation is nearing the end, I'm going to hold this up, and it says 1 minute. I hope it shows correctly. And then when it's time to wrap up, I will hold this up. Please wrap up, just to keep everyone mindful. Also, as most of you know, the slideshow will be run by my colleague Nadine. So when you're ready for your next slide, just please ask her to switch into the next slide. And so now I would like to invite Mr. Alexander Shestakov, Director of Science, Society, and Sustainable Futures Division for the Secretariat and Convention of Biological Diversity. And he will take us through actually a number of targets and also the post-2020 framework process. So his presentation will kick off this panel, which is looking at all of the targets, the 2020 targets related to environment, and biodiversity and chemicals. So Alexander, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting the Convention on Biological Diversity to be a part of this discussion. And for us, it's of course important because number of 2020 SDG targets are actually very relevant to us, and to a great extent we're inspired by deliberations of the Convention. Next slide, please. So just before coming to specific targets, I just would like to remind where some of them came from, as well as actually providing just a little bit of background on reporting on those targets. And after, just to give you an idea what is coming new in case of those targets to actually replace with some new goals and targets as related to the convention work. So I believe that many of you know that back to 2010, our Conference of the Parties at its 10th meeting adopted strategic plan for biodiversity for the period 2011-2020 and 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. So later on, those 20 biodiversity Aichi targets actually informed very much the development of SDG goals 14 and 15. And you can see that a number of specific targets under both of those goals, whether it's related to life below water or life on land, were actually informed by different Aichi targets. So recently, we have way much more information on delivery against those Aichi targets. And of course, Convention was monitoring those targets through the last 10 years. And again, for us, this year is a very important year. We call it a super biodiversity year. And it's also the year when we need to make kind of conclusions and do our assessment where we are with implementation of those targets. And we have a set of different information tools and assessments which can actually inform. And I definitely will invite you to learn more about delivery on those targets as they are related closely to SDG, whether you will be looking through the IBES global assessment. It's a very comprehensive report, which also provides information on Aichi targets. We also plan to launch Global Biodiversity Outlook, the 5th edition. That will be done mid-September, just before the General Assembly and also Biodiversity Summit at the very end of September. Our work is based very much on national information and national statistics. We receive, first of all, through some commitments by countries in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And that's for us the system of national commitments, which exist in the convention for many years, but also national reports. And last year was due for the 6 national reports. We receive a good number of those reports, which actually provide information both on implementation of Aichi targets at national level as per national biodiversity strategies and national commitments, but also provide information for us to get the picture at the global level. Next slide, please. With Aichi targets having this year as the last year and making the assessment of our progress and where we are, and I should say that unfortunately for many of 20 Aichi biodiversity targets, we're still not achieving them. For many of them, there is a good progress, but not enough to get the achievement. At the same time as the current strategic plan is coming to an end, the Convention on Biological Diversity with many stakeholders and partners is working on post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And this framework will be our key pathway for the next 30 years to achieve 2050 biodiversity vision. But of course, this is a long time, 30 years. And global biodiversity framework will formulate 2050 goals. But of course, we also will have milestones. And the first milestones will be for 2030, and that's perfectly coincide with the period of SDG goals. We also will formulate a number of action targets. Currently, there are also 20 of them in the zero draft of the framework. What is also important about this framework is that it's not only targets, that's also means of implementation and also means of monitoring and reporting. So that will be actually an integral part of the framework itself, as well as it will be implemented by a comprehensive monitoring framework, including number of indicators. Many of those indicators are actually also SDG indicators. As we plan to have this global biodiversity framework, it's not just for the convention, it's a global framework for everyone. And we expect that everyone will find their place and their role in this framework. Next slide, please. Just to give you a very rough feeling of what this framework is about. So first of all, again, just to repeat that it actually has a 30 years time frame. We also see that the framework will address all three objectives of the convention, which are conservation, sustainable use, but also equitable sharing of benefits we receive from genetic resources and from biodiversity. We also, to a great extent, see the linkage between the global biodiversity framework and SDG framework. And we see post-2020 global biodiversity framework actually as another implementation tool for SDGs and for many of them. And again, I just like to reiterate that it is global. It's not just a CBD document, even if it's negotiated under our auspices of our convention. That's actually designed to bring together all players in all sectors, unify parties and stakeholders, and definitely also further communicate importance of biodiversity and importance of tackling this crisis, which goes hand to hand with the climate change crisis. Next slide, please. So that's probably a busy slide, but it's just to give you an idea of the construction of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So as I said, we are moving towards the 2050 vision through achieving 2050 goals, but also having on the way 2030 milestone, supported by a number of targets, which are split into three main sectors. So the one is actually reducing threats. And recent IPBES global assessment report identified key 5 direct threats or direct drivers, and among them climate change, land use, over exploitation of species, pollution, which I believe we also will discuss later today with some of the goals. So, but also invasive alien species, which is also one of SDG 2020 targets. We also have a special section with targets related to meeting people's needs. And those targets are really closely related to many SDG targets, as they actually, first of all, designed to ensure that people continue to receive necessary products, services, and contributions from nature. And then, as I mentioned also, that we have a special element related to tools and solutions. And those tools and solutions are broad enough to include mainstreaming of biodiversity, but also financial issues, capacity building, addressing the elements related to consumption and production. And as you can see, all those targets are not just left on their own. They are supported by means of implementation, by the system of responsibility and transparency, and also by a set of enabling conditions. Next slide, please. So global biodiversity framework and its support to 2020 targets. As those 2020 targets has a deadline of this year, as we know, same as our Aichi targets, we already were thinking how the new targets in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework may actually support further work on those targets. And you can see that for most of those related one or another way to biodiversity, we already have some post-2020 targets as well as goals, which will contribute basically to most of them, if not to all of them. And we definitely see the continuation of work, whether we are talking about target 14.5, where currently the figure was to have 10% under marine protected areas of the entire ocean. And even if we achieve it, it doesn't mean that we should stop this work. For many others, as you will hear later today, the achievements were limited. So there is definitely further work to be done. Next slide, please. And also just to give you an idea that when we did the mapping of draft targets and goals in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework against existing SDG goals and targets, you will see that basically we see the contribution to all of them and to many targets. And that's we like to stress again that the biodiversity, the work on conservation, but also on sustainable use as well as benefit sharing is actually essential to move forward development agenda, while at the same time, very often delivery on biodiversity goals and targets is very much dependent how successful is implementation of development agenda. Next slide, please. So just as a final one for global biodiversity framework, just to give you an idea of our process and probably some key timelines. So we have already a zero draft, and we even have an updated version of goals and targets, which were actually last week issued for wide peer review. So, and I definitely invite all of you to look at our website, look at those documents, and provide your contribution, your comments to the process. For peer review, we have also a document which we call monitoring framework. So you will see there goals and targets, components of those goals and targets, monitoring elements, but also indicators. And that's again, many of you will be really important to provide your comments and your input into this process. Of course, with the changes in schedule and calendar due to pandemic, so we moved many of our key meetings, which are supposed to be this year, including the 15th Conference of the Parties, to a later stage. And at the moment, we are planning for the meetings of our subsidiary bodies, first 2 weeks of November. The SAPSTA, which is Scientific and Technical Advice Body, but also a subsidiary body on implementation. And that's where we will have in-depth discussion on different elements related to post-2020 global biodiversity framework. One of the documents we prepare for it is actually linkages between global biodiversity framework, its draft, and SDG framework. And again, it's available already on our website, so we definitely welcome and invite you to look at this document. And this document is also for peer review, so any of your ideas, any of your comments will be really important. The next negotiation session on a global biodiversity framework will happen hopefully early February. That will be at the third meeting of the open-ended working group on post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which actually should finalize the draft before sending it to Conference of the Parties. And Conference of the Parties hopefully will be around May. Again, you can see on the timeline, it's still to be determined and confirmed. So at all those steps, your input, your contribution, your participation will be extremely important, and definitely if anyone is interested. So please let us know and we will be happy to work together with you. But of course, with the COP15, it's not actually the final stage. It's a final stage for approval by convention. But similar to Aichi targets, we expect that in 2021, General Assembly will consider and approve this framework and make it actually really global. And during all this period from today until the General Assembly in 21, we definitely will need strong political support to ambitious but implement realistic, actually transformative global biodiversity framework. We will need new commitments from countries, but also from business and civil society. And we definitely hope that we will find a way how to join efforts in implementation, but also reporting on implementation on a global biodiversity framework, including doing it through the SDG channels, because we really believe both processes can strongly support each other. Next slide, please. So after providing this general picture where we are, where some of 2020 SDG targets came from, so I would cover 4 of those 2020 targets, and many other targets will be covered by colleagues in subsequent presentations. So I would start with target 14.5, and really happy to do that, as first of all, it is one of the SDG targets which is based on Aichi biodiversity targets, and specifically target 11. And that's why the CBD was closely monitoring its implementation as part of the Convention strategic plan, but also as a delivery on this SDG target. There has been a significant expansion of marine protected areas over the last 20 years. As of June 2020, almost 27 million square kilometers, or roughly 7.4% of the entire ocean, is covered by marine protected areas. It is actually a nearly 9-fold increase from 3 million square kilometers in 2000, or actually from 3.1 in 2010. So that's still a significant increase. And we have a good news. So for marine areas under national jurisdiction, the 10% target has already been reached and actually could be increased even to over 20%. And it's also possible that 10% target for the entire ocean will be reached this year in 2020, with a condition: if countries will complete their national commitments done through national and international instrument. If all already existing commitments can be completed within the next 6 months, it will bring global coverage to almost 11%. So that's definitely one of successes, both of Aichi targets, but also of SDGs. SDG 14.5 has focused largely on increasing the quantity of marine protected areas coverage, missing many of elements of quality coverage, which we have under Aichi target 11. And those include management effectiveness, connectivity, ecological representativeness, coverage of important ecological areas, etc. And we have progress, in those elements as well. So, for example, the mean coverage of key biodiversity areas increased from 30% in 2000 to over 40% in 2010, and then further increased after 2010, so reaching actually 46% by the end of last year. But there are still definitely some obstacles in the progress. First of all, the progress is extremely uneven. Please, next slide. It's very uneven among countries and regions. So we have a dominance in a limited number of countries or regions, while actually not that much coming from others. There is a very significant lag in reporting. Countries creating and gazetting the marine protected areas, but they forget to properly report it to the global database. There is also less focus on implementation and effectiveness after designation of new marine protected areas. So while actually trying to get the number of square kilometers, and that's definitely the area of focus for the future. What kind of opportunities we have? We also should remember that Aichi target, when initially was formulated for marine realm, included not only marine protected areas, but also other effective area-based conservation measures. And definition of other effective area-based conservation measures was done within the convention at the end of 2018. but we already have a global database which is ready to record those other effective area-based conservation measures. And that's need to be done. We definitely need to significantly improve reporting. So we also need to significantly increase capacity at national level, both to deal with marine protected areas, to develop them, to manage them, ensure that they are effective, but also to report on that. And definitely a very special work on capacity building in relation to understanding, identification and reporting of other effective area-based conservation measures. And we need further to encourage countries with commitments to urgency and as a matter of urgency to advance designation within the next 6 months. Next slide, please. So also 5, but 15.5 target. And here, unfortunately, I can't be that much optimistic as with the previous one. As a number of other 2020 targets under SDG Goal 15, this target, unfortunately, is not to be met this year. Land degradation continues, biodiversity loss is occurring at an alarming rate, invasive alien species and illicit harvest and trafficking of wildlife continue, and despite actually the efforts, but also undermining significant efforts for protection and restoring vital ecosystems. And I think that some of those elements related to degradation and forest, again, colleagues will cover in other targets. The most fundamental and irreversible human impact on nature is to a great extent species extinction. And target 15.5 has one indicator, that's actually the red list index. Extinction is threatening sustainable development and compromise global heritage. Is driven primarily through habitat loss from unsustainable land use practices, overexploitation and trade, deforestation, pollution, invasive alien species, and climate change. Globally, the species extinction risk has worsened by about 10% over the last 3 decades. And with the red list index, which is measuring the risk of extinction, whereby a value of 1 indicates no threat of extinction and the value of 0 indicates that all species are extinct. And unfortunately, it's declining from 0.82 in 1990 to 0.75 in 2015 and to 0.73 this year. Next slide, please. What are the obstacles? We have many obstacles. It's very often lack of funding. It's very often lack of prioritizing. It's a scale of existing activities and actually initiatives, including conservation initiatives, which actually today not commensurate with the challenge we have. It's biased sometimes toward particular ecosystem of species. It's very much lack of data, information, and monitoring system. And it's really lack of coordination between ministries and between sectors. But we have definitely some opportunities to move forward. We need to continue identification of key priority areas for conservation and do this conservation and management. We significantly need to improve recognition of land tenure. We need to provide new incentives for sustainable management of species, but also sustainable management of their habitats. We need to continue promoting integrated land use planning. So promoting community-based conservation. Work really a lot on providing for better connectivity and developing different kind of corridors, both in terrestrial and marine realm, to support high quality of habitats. Next slide, please. So moving to another 2020 target, which also is informed by Aichi target and which is actually one of 5 key biodiversity loss drivers. That's about invasive alien species, which is correspond to Aichi target 9. The progress to be measured here through the SDG indicators is based on proportion of countries adopting relevant national legislation and adequately resourcing the prevention of control of invasive alien species. In terms of legislation, we have some progress, although as you can see on the graph, we have very little information. A big number of countries didn't really provide information on where they are in achieving this target. On another map, you may see the number of countries with a different level of legislation. So if you see the dark blue color, that actually shows the countries with pretty good legislation where the progress was made significant. But you will see also many other countries where it's still a lot of work to be done, and in some cases, there is actually just no regulations to address invasive alien species. So based on the latest national reports we have, only 22 countries reported they meet invasive alien species targets, and only 38 countries has some progress, but insufficient progress. So there is actually a lot of work to be done on this area of work, and it requires serious attention, bearing in mind that invasive alien species might also transmit zoonotic diseases, and full control and management of those species will be an important part of prevention measures for the future pandemics. Next slide, please. There are many obstacles for the work on invasive alien species, which probably we can't show all of them here. So probably what I like to stress is definitely the lack of capacity in many countries, both to develop legislation and regulations, but also to identify, monitor, control, and track early those species, as well as having resources to tackle those species. There is a substantial lack of interagency cooperation and the whole government approach to invasive alien species, which actually required. There is increasing volume of trade, which actually accelerates the spread, including unintentional introductions. There are also new ways, new pathways, for example, including e-trade and e-commerce through the internet. But as of course, for other targets, we have a number of opportunities, and we know how we can accelerate the action, having political momentum, but also having the political will for that. So we definitely further need to address key pathways. We need to put more preventive measures rather than actually reacting and focusing on when invasive alien species already were established on somebody's territory. We need to facilitate more safe international trade and transport. So we need to put a priority for eradication of invasive alien species on islands. The priority measures need to be taken for a better ports of entry control. And also very important part is early detection and rapid response. And of course, as I mentioned already, so the development of regulations as well as the rest of the work on invasive alien species is very much dependent on capacity development and transfer of technologies, but also scientific cooperation and sharing knowledge. Next slide, please. So that's a long intervention, but I have the last couple slides and last target to report on. And this one is very complex while being very much in focus of biodiversity community during last several years. Reporting on this SDG target is linked to the analysis of the progress towards national targets established in accordance with Aichi Biodiversity Target 2. And that's actually about mainstreaming, about integrating ecosystems biodiversity into the sectors. There is a progress in a number of countries, although very slow. Although I should say that of 132 parties sharing their last 6 national report, 113 assessed their progress towards the targets. It actually shows the understanding of importance of it. Overall, parties have a goal on this target, but their execution happens at the level of insufficient to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. 5% report has no progress at all, and in 2%, it's actually even going backward. The last slide, please. So lack of mainstreaming and application of whole of government approaches is actually the major impediment in success. Involvement of decision-making into this process and understanding by decision makers of importance of biodiversity is a substantial obstacle. Translating existing regulatory framework to regional and local levels, another serious impediment. What we can do is that, so we definitely can develop practical methodologies, assessment, and tool for mainstreaming biodiversity into national development strategies. The linkages between biodiversity strategies, action plan, development strategies, land use planning strategies, national economic strategies, as well as financial sector documents. That's actually essential to make a progress in this area. And involving strategic upstream finance and territorial management players, that's a key in this area. So we can't do it within our biodiversity circles. We really need unified approach, and that's where the integrity with other sectors working together and solidarity is probably the key and super important. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Thank you so much. I'm hearing some feedback. Thank you very much for that. We have some questions for you in the chat box, but we'll come back to the end. I'd now like to introduce Ms. Irene Hoffman, who is the Secretary on the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and she will report on Target 2.5. Irene, you have the floor.
Good afternoon from Rome, and thank you very much for inviting me to this. I would like to start by saying plant and animal genetic resources are the basis for sustainable agriculture, food security, and nutrition. The first part of this target, to maintain the genetic diversity, is covered by 2 indicators related to the conservation of plant and animal genetic resources, including in medium to long-term conservation facilities, which are gene banks. And so far, no indicator has been developed for the second component of the target on access and benefit sharing, which is a very similar wording to target 15.6. Next slide, please. At the end of 2019, the global plant genetic material has come up to 5.4 million accessions. And the growth rate of these accessions stored, which averaged about 100,000 per year since the 1995, has slowed down, as you can see on the left part. The regional distribution of accession is very uneven, as you can see on the right. And in North America and in Europe, there is the highest number of accessions in absolute terms and also the highest level of growth rate. The species listed by the IUCN as being of global major concern are also conserved in these gene banks. However, crop wild relatives, wild food plants, neglected and underutilized crop species continue to be either missing in the gene banks or they have their intraspecific diversity poorly represented. Next slide. We're now moving to animal genetic resources, where the diversity is measured with 2 indicators. Between 2010 and 2019, the number of local breeds, and these are breeds that occur only in one country, with sufficient material stored to allow them to be reconstituted in case of extinction, has increased from 10 to 110, which is the green bar in the left pie, which is still a very tiny proportion of the approximately 7,600 breeds that are reported globally. This is particularly worrisome because, as you can see on the right slide, for about 65% of the local breeds, the risk status remains unknown. This is the gray part in the pie. Of those breeds with a known risk status, 73% are at risk of extinction, which is a very high number. These results differ between regions, and for several regions, the results are not representative because of the scarce information reported. Next slide. So we do have issues on data. There is very little available data and low levels of reporting. In principle, for both sectors, in situ conservation is possible with small amounts of material and populations, but this is very difficult to monitor, and it is hardly monitored. For plant genetic resources, the documentation is poorly standardized within and across national gene banks. We don't know much how much diversity exists in the field. For example, the diversity of crops conserved ex situ is therefore used as a proxy of the entire available diversity. For livestock, not many countries do regular livestock censuses, and even less censuses at the breed level because of the costs involved. Also, countries may not be interested to increase the population size of their local breeds. Overall, we find that there is negligible process in maintaining plant and animal genetic diversity for food and agriculture. This means that the ongoing efforts to conserve these crucial resources for our nutrition and our well-being seem to be inadequate given the threats that are posed on their biodiversity with economic, environmental, climate, and social changes. As a link, we see that in the SDG indicator 241, in the biodiversity subcomponent, a question is asked on the presence of local breeds on the farm. In future, the Commission may wish to develop sub-indicators for forest and aquatic genetic resources for food and agriculture, which are also plant and animals. And the link to the target 15.6 I have already mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. Again, we have some questions coming for you, but we will come back to that at the end of the session. I would now like to invite Mr. Joachim Harlan, Chief of Freshwater Unit at UNEP, to report on Target 6.6. Joachim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. The good news is I only got one slide, so I'm going to speak on Target 6.6 using this one and only slide. Target 6.6 is about freshwater ecosystems. It's about protecting and restoring them. And we now in our second round of global data drives for this particular target. It has only one indicator. Now, the indicator talks about change in the extent of water-related ecosystems over time. So first of all, what are those freshwater ecosystems? So we've subdivided this into lakes and rivers, looking at surface water and the change of the spatial extent of surface water, both permanent and seasonal surface waters over time. We've separated out reservoirs as they can both occur and we get new ones, and also sometimes they're taken down, and they're obviously controlled and regulated. So we look at also how these reservoirs and the surface water extent changes in them. We for the lakes, we also are looking at water quality, and then we have wetlands, specifically vegetated wetlands, and also mangroves. Mangroves being in the borderline between the freshwater and the marine environment, the coastal zones mainly. Now, when we, as a custodian agency for this indicator, started the first global data drive in 2017, this again is a joint effort together with UN Water and the Integrated Monitoring Initiative for SDG 6. We developed a template for data collection for these different freshwater ecosystems, and we submitted this out to the 193 member states to request data. The response we had was should I say, quite scattered, diverse in nature. We did not get very many countries to report, and the information we received was very difficult to compare and use for statistical analysis, and therefore the methodology basically wasn't fit for purpose as an SDG methodology. So after some review, and also with the development of Earth observation technology, we initiated quite a large partnership, especially with the European Joint Research Center from the European Commission, as well as with Google and some further partners, to revise the whole methodology to be completely based on Earth observations, global data. And I'm pleased to tell you that we have managed now to create a complete platform with 20 years of data, down to a resolution of 30 by 30 meters over the whole globe for all these parameters that I've just mentioned. And we have initiated now a new data drive. And the difference this time round is that with this information on what we call the Freshwater Ecosystems Explorer, you can see the web link there. It's called SDG661.app. You're most welcome to explore the Freshwater Ecosystems Explorer and download and the information and use it. And using with this information, countries can get, of course, the aggregation to the national level, and they can then validate and approve the information there for SDG reporting purposes. They can obviously also feedback information to us as a custodian agency, and also with some complementary information that we also request if available, for example, on groundwater, as well as on river flows. And as of today, as you can see there, we reached out to the 193 member states of the UN, that's all member states, and 163 countries have validated and approved so far. And we still halfway through this data drive, and we're hoping to conclude this in August, so that we can then consolidate and work on the statistics and be able to report it by the end of the year. Thank you very much. And back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Exactly on time. I appreciate it very much. Now I would like to hand the floor to Ms. Tessa Govers, UNEP coordinator of the subprogram on chemicals, waste, and air quality, who will tell us about target 12.4. Tessa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Goal 12 is about ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. And the 2020 target that we focus on today is target 12.4, to achieve by 2020 the environmentally sound management of chemicals and all wastes throughout their life cycle, in accordance with agreed international frameworks and significant significantly reduce their release to air, water, and soil in order to minimize their adverse impacts on human health and the environment. So what's the current status? One of the main conclusions of the second Global Chemicals Outlook, a major assessment that was published last year, showed that the minimization of the adverse impacts of chemicals and waste will not be achieved by 2020. Yet target 12.4 remains highly relevant and there's a need to step up action. If we look at the two indicators under this target, we see some progress on 12.4.1, which is measuring the number of parties to international multilateral environmental agreements on hazardous waste and other chemicals that meet their commitments and obligations in transmitting information as required by each relevant agreement. There's an encouraging trend for the parties of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, with an average 41% of the parties transmitting required information over the period 2015-2019, compared to 35% in the previous period. And for the Minamata Convention on Mercury, this was only the first year to report, as the convention entered into force into 2017. And an overwhelming majority of parties complied with their obligations, bringing the reporting rate to 68%. The Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer has, through the implementation of the protocol's control measure, phased out 99% of the consumption and production of ozone-depleting substances. Historically, all parties have ultimately achieved 100% compliance with their annual reporting obligations. If you look at the second indicator on hazardous waste, however, limited data is available and the indicator has only recently been reclassified as Tier 2. The first reporting cycle for indicator 12.4.2 on hazardous waste generated per capita and proportion of hazardous waste treated by type of treatment is focusing on e-waste. From 2010 to 2019, the global e-waste generated grew from 5.3 to 7.3 kilograms per capita annually, and the e-waste recycled increased in a slower pace from 0.8 to 1.3 kilogram per capita per annum. The use and subsequent disposal of electronic and electrical equipment thus significantly contributes to large stockpiles of waste. In terms of the obstacles, the focus of measuring the target is process-oriented and showing some major data gaps. It's hard to get a global picture of the actual levels of, for example, chemicals pollution in environmental media or adverse impacts on health. Some regions lack infrastructure to, for example, properly deal with e-waste. Having said that, with an increased realization that to address sound management of chemicals and waste throughout their life cycle, a circular approach is needed, more and more countries are embracing circularity, also in building back their economies after the COVID-19 pandemic. Interlinkages with other frameworks also provide opportunities, such as with the post-2020 biodiversity framework, where pollution is actually one of the threats leading to biodiversity loss. Other important linkages exist with many of the SDG targets, and notably with those for health, freshwater, cities, and marine pollution. Last, the chemicals and waste community is currently reviewing the future approach through the intersessional process, considering the strategic approach to international chemicals management, or SICHM, and the sound management of chemicals and waste beyond 2020. To accelerate action on target 12.4, we look forward to a good outcome of this process, leading to an ambitious policy framework. Decisions are expected at the 5th meeting of the International Conference on Chemicals Management in July 2021. As the target refers to a holistic approach to chemicals management and all waste, it also will benefit from scientific assessments, such as the upcoming Global Waste Management Outlook 2, and looking at the follow-up and the number of chemicals and waste-related United Nations Environment Assembly resolutions and declarations, not least on the implementation plan towards a pollution-free planet. And finally, of course, strong financial support, such as seen from the Global Environment Facility, remains critical in supporting MEA implementation and accelerating action. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Excellent. And again, thank you for the timeliness. And we will be returning to you and all panelists with questions at the end. I would now like to invite Ms. Ludgard Koppens, head of the SDG and Environment Statistics Unit of UNEP, to talk about target 14.2. Thank you, Lud.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm currently in Belgium. That's why it's afternoon. So I will say a few words about the target 14.2, which is basically by 2020 sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems. Now, due to human activities, global climate change and environmental problems have led to threats to the marine ecosystems and the environment. So the management and the conservation of marine areas is essential. And that includes marine spatial planning, intercoastal zone management, protected areas, ecosystem-based adaptation plans, and other forms of marine management. They all play a part in managing the oceans. And here already you can see the interlinkages with other indicators that were mentioned earlier on the biodiversity, and you can already see other linkages. Now, the formal indicator is a very simple policy indicator that looks at the number of countries with a policy in place. Here, the 18 regional seas programs aim to address the accelerating degradation of the world and coastal areas through the sustainable management and use of the marine and coastal environment, engaging neighboring countries in comprehensive and specific actions to protect their shared marine environment. So the monitoring is based on existing reporting under the core set indicators of the Regional Seas Conventions. The first data reporting is expected to be compiled and reported in 2020. So there's not much to say about the progress made so far. Additionally, countries are encouraged to also provide supplementary information on national level monitoring, and that includes ecological parameters such as the state of biodiversity, the water quality, habitat quality, and ecosystems health. Now, this indicator only measures policy formulation. It doesn't look at policy implementation. But some countries are implementing their own national proxy indicator. And one example is Colombia, which has a national indicator on intercoastal zone management implementation. Now, let's look a bit at obstacles, opportunities, interlinkages, and accelerating action. As there is a high degree of connectivity between the marine and the terrestrial systems, information on ocean management should be used in conjunction with information related to the terrestrial environment, climate, and the socioeconomic situation. And here again, that refers to the previous speakers and the information that can be gained from there. Oceanic resources, which provide food regulation services and other resources, are essential for life. And that means that they are currently not considered in traditional measures of national productivity. So,
excuse me, Lud. I'm sorry. Can all panelists please mute? Thank you. Thank you, Ludgard. Continue.
Yeah. So the UN Statistical Division, UNEP, ESCAP, and other partners are now working to develop a formal statistical standard for ocean accounting in the context of the System for Environmental Economic Accounting. And that allows to bring in ocean pollution, ocean ecosystem conditions, drivers, pressures, and governance of the oceans. Another important action that is taken is that in the UN has declared in 2021 to 2030 to be the decade of ocean science for sustainable development. And so that will increase the generation of qualitative and quantitative ocean knowledge, which should inform development of solutions that contribute to sustainable development and hopefully catalyze behavioral change that is required for implementation. But finally, there's one word I would like to say also is, and it has been mentioned by Shantanu, the drastic reduction in human activity, which was brought about by the COVID-19 crisis, is also an opportunity to have a recovery path that is more sustainable in harmony with natural environment. It's really an opportunity to build back better. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lutgaard, and thank you for bringing in the link to our current situation. Again, we'll be returning to you with any questions from the floor. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Yimin Yi, Head of Marine and Inland Fisheries Branch at FAO Fisheries and Aquaculture Department, to present on Target 14.4. Yimin, you have
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. The target I'm going to talk about is 1441. Target 1441 requires all countries by 2020 effectively regulate harvesting and overfishing and illegal fishing and implementing science-based management plans to restore fish stocks in the shortest time feasible to levels that can produce maximum sustainable yield. So you can see it contains many elements. The indicator used to monitor target 14.4 is indicator 14.41. It's about the percentages of biologically sustainable stocks. From the graph, you can see the annual variations of the percentage over the period from 1974 to 2017. The pink color indicates the percentage of fish stocks at the biologically unsustainable levels. The dark green color indicates the percentages of fish stocks within biologically sustainable levels. So you can see quite clearly from the graph, in 1974, the percentage of biologically sustainable stocks was at 90%. Since then, it has gradually decreased and reached to about 66% in 2017. So from the graph, you can also see the current state is a decreasing trend, and the trend has not been reversed. However, over the last decades, you can see the rate of decrease slowed down. This is because of improvement of fish stock status in some countries and areas. It's worth to mention here, the assessment was done by the FAO statistical area, not by country levels. Next slide, please. Yeah, this graph shows the spatial variation of indicator 1441. Again, it's used the FAO statistical areas. And you can see from the graph, there are great variations between areas. The lowest percentage was 37.5% in Mediterranean and Black Sea area. The highest percentage was 86.7% in the East Central Pacific. As you may know, stock assessment is quite data demanding and technically quite challenging. So over the time, we have seen the lack of technical capacity, infrastructure, and sufficient data for stock assessment in developing world. And it's also worth to mention, FAO is now trying to update the methodology for country-level assessment. If you look at target 14.4, actually it's quite similar to CBD H target 6. H target 6 requires by 2020, all fish and invertebrate stocks are harvested sustainably, implement ecosystem approach, and overfishing is avoided, and the impact of fisheries on stocks, species, and ecosystem are within safe ecological limits. So if you compare the wording of the two targets, actually they are quite similar. Only exception is H target 6 extends a bit more into the ecosystem matters. Finally, about the plan and the potential to accelerate actions. Over the time, we have seen more and more countries have adopted the target and gear up their effort to manage their fisheries sustainably. So over the last decade or so, we have seen more and more overfished stock recovering, particularly in some well-developed countries. And another thing, I think it's quite important, there is urgent need for global partnership to strengthen technical capacity and governance in many developing countries. I think the global partnership is specifically dealt by SDG 14. Finally, to facilitate the operational matters, FAO has developed an e-learning course on the indicator and try to facilitate stock assessment and country reporting. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Yemen. Very interesting. And again, we will return with questions at the end. I would now like to invite Mr. Matthew Camilleri, head of the Fishing Operations and Technology Branch at FAO Fisheries and Aquaculture Department, to report on target 14.6. Matthew, you have the floor.
Yes, hello everybody. It's a privilege for me to address all attendees connected with us from all over the world. The sustainability of fisheries resources is heavily threatened by overcapacity, overfishing, and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Overcapacity, where fleets are too large and not commensurate with the availability of resources. Overfishing, where the exploitation of fish stocks goes beyond sustainable levels. And IUU fishing, which is really the lack of or the undermining of sound fisheries conservation and management. Now, this actually focuses on the elimination of subsidies which may contribute to overcapacity, overfishing, and IUU fishing. And this target has predicted that the subsidies should be eliminated by 2020. Now, the IAEG, the Interagency Expert Group, chose to focus the measurement of reaching this target on IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And so the indicator is measuring the rate or the extent of implementation of international instruments aiming to combat IUU fishing. Now, these instruments contain flag state responsibilities, port state, coastal state, and market state responsibilities. These instruments are namely the UN Law of the Sea Convention, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, the Port State Measures Agreement, the Compliance Agreement, the International Plan of Action to combat IUU fishing, and the guidelines on flag state performance. This SDG target, clearly you have noticed already surely that it is very much linked to the previous target 14.4, where it also calls for ending overfishing, IUU fishing and destructive practices. But it also is linked up to 14C, where you have the implementation of the Law of the Sea Convention on its own, and target 14.2, which calls for the sustainable management and protection of marine and coastal ecosystems, because clearly IUU fishing does threaten marine and coastal ecosystems. And also more generally relevant to targets 1, 2, 8, and 17 to end poverty, hunger, decent work, and also the support in developing partnerships. Next slide, please. So this is the measure we have. We've run this twice in 2018 and 2020. And in general, worldwide, we can see that out of a scale of 5, where in 2018 we had a scale of 3 at global level out of 5 on the progress in the degree of implementation of instruments to combat IUU fishing, now at global level we have reached a level of 4. But you can see, of course, there are variations around the world. In some areas they've reached the level 5, in other areas they are down to level 2. Clearly, as you can see in the bottom 2 bars, the least developed countries and the small island developing states have only reached a level of 3, and this is not surprising because these are countries that require capacity development for them to fulfill their port, flag, coastal, and market state responsibilities. Now, beyond just going into the implementation of these crucial, critical international instruments that aim to combat IUU fishing, what are we looking at? The next steps would be to strengthen cooperation amongst states to combat IUU fishing, to develop schemes, to exchange information, to develop actions together to take action against countries, including making sure that no vessels engaged in IUU fishing are receiving subsidies or will continue to receive any subsidies. Transparency, the importance of states to exchange information more broadly. Under the Port State Measures Agreement, there is a provision to develop a global information exchange system. This is happening already at regional level by a number of regional fishery management organizations, but we need to take this transparency at a higher level at global scale. And of course, the increase in compliance with the provisions in each of these international instruments is important. Transshipment is, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, transshipment is an activity of concern because it can take place in ports, on the high seas, and is not always regulated and gives an open window for those engaged in IUU fishing to launder their fish. Transshipment is not always bad, but it could be, and therefore this is something that the international community is focusing on and aiming perhaps to develop international guidelines for that. Then finally, to conclude this presentation, the WTO Subsidies Discussion. This is, of course, at the heart of this target. The WTO, unfortunately, this year was organizing a ministerial conference to try to conclude the negotiations on the regulation of fishery subsidies, the harmful fishery subsidies, but this has had to be postponed. And therefore, everything is based really on the finalization and the eventual coming into force of the regulation of harmful subsidies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Excellent. And now we would like to move on to our final presentation before the Q&A session, and that is Mr. Anssi Pekarinen, Team Leader for Global Forest Resources Assessment of FAO, and he will report on 2 targets, 15.1 and 15.2.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, evening, everyone. The target 15.1 is by 2020, ensure the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of terrestrial and inland freshwater ecosystems and their services, in particular forests, wetlands, mountains, and drylands, in line with the obligations under international agreements. The target has two indicators, 15.1.1, which is forest area as a percentage of total land area, and 15.1.2, proportion of important sites for terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity that are covered by protected areas by ecosystem type. Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations is the custodian agency for 15.1.1, the forest indicator, and the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Center is the custodian for biodiversity indicator 15.1.2. Let's start with the progress with the 15.1.1. The world's forest area continues to shrink, though at a slightly slower pace than in previous decades. As of today, the world has a total forest area of about 4.1 billion hectares, or 31% of the land area, which is roughly half a hectare of forest for every person on this planet. The proportion of forest area declined from 31.9% in 2000 to 31.2% in 2020, as indicated by the indicator 15.1.1 illustration on the right-hand side of the slide. This represents a net loss of almost 100 million hectares of forest, primarily due to agricultural expansion. Africa has now become the hotspot of forest loss, with an average annual net forest area loss of 3.9 million hectares in the period 2010 to 2020, followed by South America at 2.6 million hectares per year. When looking at the other indicator, 15.1.2, and the latest report, on average, only 44% of each terrestrial and 41% of each freshwater key biodiversity areas was within a protected area, an increase of around 12 to 13 percentage points since 2000. However, the majority of terrestrial and freshwater key biodiversity areas still have incomplete or no coverage by protected areas. For instance, according to 2018 data, key biodiversity areas have been identified in biodiversity hotspots for 21% of all globally threatened species on the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List. However, of these sites, only 13% are fully within protected areas, while another 31% are only partially covered by protected areas. Moreover, since 2010, the increase in coverage of key biodiversity areas by protected areas has slowed considerably compared to the previous decade. What are the main challenges then? Halting deforestation is certainly one of them, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeastern Asia. Losing forests has a negative impact on a number of important things, including livelihoods in rural communities, carbon emissions, biodiversity, and the land degradation. While agriculture is the main driver of forest loss, accounting for more than 70% of tropical deforestation, the deforestation can have a negative impact also on agriculture. It has been estimated that the land degradation and desertification resulting from forest loss could cut agricultural production up to 10% globally by 2050. In summary, urgent action is needed to halt deforestation and forest degradation and to promote and implement sustainable agriculture and sustainable use of forest resources. Regarding the biodiversity indicator, the fact that majority of key biodiversity areas are still with incomplete or no coverage by protected areas highlights the importance of establishing and effectively managing protected areas. Focused attention is needed to safeguard sites known for their rich biodiversity. And let's move to the other target, 15.2. Next slide, please. The SDG target 15.2 is by 2020, promote the implementation of sustainable management of all types of forests, halt deforestation, restore degraded forests, and substantially increase afforestation and reforestation globally. The related indicator 15.2.1, progress towards sustainable forest management, has 5 sub-indicators. Forest area, annual net change rate, above ground biomass stock in forest, proportion of forest area located within legally established protected areas, proportion of forest area under a long-term forest management plan, and forest area under an independently verified forest management certification scheme. While forest loss remains high, the 2020 data collected through the Global Forest Resources Assessment of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations shows that there are growing efforts to manage forests sustainably. The right-hand part of the present slide summarizes these efforts using a traffic light system indicating the trends. It shows that 4 out of 5 sub-indicators, namely the above ground biomass, proportion of forest in protected areas, forest under long-term management plans, as well as certified forest area, increased or remained stable at the global level and in most regions of the world. Today, out of 4.06 billion hectares of forest, more than half are subject to management plans. Additionally, 18% of the global forest area is now found within protected areas. However, while the net forest area loss is slowing, more action is needed. Global and regional efforts to preserve and sustain forest ecosystems, as well as their social, economic, and environmental functions, should be further pursued with particular emphasis on the tropics and developing countries. So what do we plan to do then? Among the current plans to accelerate action by the UN are the United Nations Strategic Plan for Forest 2017-2030, which provides a global framework for actions at all levels to sustainably manage all types of forest and trees outside forest and halt deforestation and forest degradation. Second, the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration 2021 to 2030 will make an important contribution towards achieving a number of SDG targets by uniting the world behind a common goal: prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. Third, as one of the related efforts, at the 25th Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in December 2019, 7 heads of UN agencies committed to turn the tide of deforestation and emphasized the common goal of helping countries to reduce deforestation and forest degradation and improve forest management, building on existing efforts to provide technical and financial support and working together. Key to halting deforestation is addressing forestry, food security, and climate change challenges altogether. And finally, United Nations collaborative program on reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, REDD+, builds on the convening role and technical expertise of 3 UN agencies: Food and Agriculture Organization, UN Development Programme, and the UN Environment Programme, to support nationally led REDD+ processes. REDD+ has already resulted in better forest monitoring capacity in roughly 40 countries, and that has resulted in 45 submissions of forest reference level to UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In addition, the 12 submissions of the REDD+ results to the already mentioned UNFCCC total to estimated 8.8 billion tons for CO2 emission reductions. Thank you. Over to you, Stefan.
Anssi, thank you so much for that very rich presentation and very efficient. So thank you to all of the presenters. We are now in a fairly good situation time-wise, and we have time for questions and answers. As I've said, we've gotten several from the chat box during the session from participants and attendees. We also received a number of questions in advance through the registration form. So I'm going to go through and choose a few questions, and sort of especially on themes that are recurring in the questions. And if it's all right, I'll call on some of the panelists and direct questions in your way. So the first question that I'd like to do is for Irene, and it will be on agroecology. Let me just find it. Excuse me. Okay, for Irene, what are the strategies to engage and promote agroecological practices of smallholder, Indigenous, and ethnic minority farmers? And as you're thinking about this question, just keep in mind this was kind of a compilation of several questions. So it's talking about agroecology and also the role of smallholder farmers, and also bringing in aspects of sort of promoting sustainability through the private sector in that context. So Irene, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, this is a very, let's say, comprehensive question and related to the SDGs. It covers several aspects of SDG 2, 14, 15, also aspects of 12 and 13, part of which we have heard already. So let me start by saying that a large share of the food is produced by smallholders and family farmers. And smallholders and indigenous people are also custodians of much of the genetic resources for food and agriculture that we address in the target 2.5. But I would like to expand this question, because there's a lot of talk about the radical transformation that is needed of agricultural sectors. And for FAO, that means agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, and food systems. And that has to cover all of the sectors, not only small, but also large farms, and as you said, the value chain actors. We did a global assessment on biodiversity for food and agriculture last year. And this State of the World report has listed more than 20 practices that are perceived as biodiversity friendly, and many of them are very location specific. Many of them are based on traditional knowledge. What comes out is, first, people need secure tenure to be able to plan in advance and also make investments. And this for smallholders is often not given. Then the link between the sustainability of the practice and the outcome in terms of biodiversity needs further information. Therefore, we need more research. We also need to innovate some of the traditional practices, and we need to scale them up through capacity development and so on. And that brings us to a crucial component, which is enabling environment, that these farmers are actually encouraged to uptake sustainable practices. And governments come into that. For example, they can reduce those subsidies that are environmentally harmful. For example, on fertilizers, they can give incentives, for example, payment for ecosystem services, and they can get the prices right. And that links to what Sasha explained, 15.9 on biodiversity values. And then we have a sort of horizontal activity, which is in the community landscape, seascape level, where people have to work together and implement these practices beyond just what they do on their farm, but also what the neighbors do and so on, to give habitats for broader biodiversity. And at the vertical level, there is a link to the business. You need services and extension and inputs for the farmers to be able to produce, but very importantly also, you need markets for the products. You need a market that recognizes sustainable practices, for example, in certification schemes. Farmers need to empower and have contact with consumers, and short value chains are a recognized tool for that. You can expand your local market like through e-commerce. And again, governments have a very important role, for example, through public procurement. If public procurement for schools and canteens and so on says, we want food that is produced through sustainable practices by smallholder farmers, then you create this market and you give incentives and empower those people to produce. Thank you, over.
Thank you so much, Irene. I would like to now continue in the same theme of the private sector and turn to fisheries. We have a question from an attendee, and I will summarize the question, but is how could the UN support regional aquaculture development and conservation, knowing that ocean acidification, microplastics, and eutrophication are ongoing? So perhaps, Yimin, you could talk about aquaculture and the role of the private sector and how the UN can promote aquaculture. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for the question. I think, yeah, first I wanted to make it clear is I'm not working on aquaculture, so I'm not exactly the person who should answer the question. But I think FAO has a branch really called aquaculture. So there are many people working on aquaculture and including all the, the eutrophication and fishing seeds or sustainable aquaculture also. But there is some connection because I'm working on capture fisheries, and you can see many aquaculture use the feed, which is wild fish captured from wild fisheries, mainly pelagic species. So if you are interested in this kind of things, I think you probably know there is a paper published in Science 1 year or 2 years ago. It's about the impact of aquaculture on capture fisheries. So there is some close connection, and obviously aquaculture have some impact on capture fishery. And if we wanted to have sustainable capture fisheries, and certainly sustainable aquaculture, it should be ensured. So I think, yeah, it's quite a complicated issue, and for many pelagic species, and they are quite a big catch, like Peruvian anchovy or so. But in many Southeast Asian countries, and the people probably use the small pelagic also for aquaculture feeds. So there is a close connection. So if I would suggest, if the question is really interested in this question, please contact the FAO Agriculture branch. I think I'm sure they have lots of experts working on this, and also they have lots of projects to help member countries to develop aquaculture. Because at the moment, it seems the capture fish production has stabilized, which means there is quite a limited potential to increase. So to meet the increasing demand from the increasing human population, and aquaculture certainly is going to play a huge role to meet the food security issues around the world. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimin. Matthew, did you want to add on this question?
Yes, well, just because the question touched upon microplastics and eutrophication, etc., I think it's appropriate to take advantage of the situation and mention that we, as FAO, we're trying to contribute to the reduction of plastics in the ocean, simply because fishing gear, well, 90% of fishing gear is made of plastic, and a lot of it is often lost at sea. We refer to abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear. Now, a few years ago, international guidelines were negotiated on the marking of fishing gear to help reduce the contribution of fishing gear to plastic pollution in the ocean. And this is under my responsibility, actually, within my branch, and we're trying to promote the guidelines and get countries to develop schemes to mark fishing gear and to develop schemes to be able to retrieve any lost or abandoned fishing gear. So I thought that perhaps I should mention this. It could be relevant. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. In fact, that also is relevant to another question that we were going to raise, which comes from an audience member talking about the fact that some countries have legislated bans against plastic, and how can we get more countries to do the same. And I would like to combine, if it's all right, I would like to combine that question with another question and send them both to Tessa. And the other one that is coming in through the chat box for Tessa is saying, according to your experience, what should be the main components of the next SciChem beyond 2020 that would promote safe management of chemicals and wastes? So a very large question, but if you want to try to take both of those and kind of building on what Matthew said, where he was speaking specifically from the fishing gear and ghost equipment and that sort of thing in terms of plastics, if you want to take that a little bit more broadly, Tessa, and speak to those two questions, that would be wonderful. Tessa, over to you.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. And indeed, that's a very big question added to the one on plastics. Just to start with the question on plastics, it's really key that we look at the sustainable consumption and production here to kind of avoid this form of pollution. And the first is really to keep plastics in the value chain. But indeed, there are some products that really kind of constitute the majority of what ends up in the environment. Or in landfill, and in the end in the ocean, if not properly dealt with. Yes, so indeed a large number of countries are looking into this, and we actually did a study end of last year. We published a report on that, on legal limits on single-use plastics and microplastics, and found that indeed 127 out of 192 countries had taken some form of measures. So what's really important here is of course to kind of raise the awareness. There's campaigns like Clean Seas, Big Pollution, and so on. But also actually the reporting is really critical here. So the comparing of what countries have undertaken in what context, and also then sort of what was the effectiveness, and that links a little bit to also the, it's not a 2020 target, but indicator 14.1.1 on actually marine litter, and know what we actually can see as the results and in the ocean, actually in the efforts to prevent plastics from ending up in the ocean. I would like to point out that it's also very relevant to the indicator that I refer to, 12.4.1, because the Basel Convention actually has made an amendment, and this is actually an amendment that is going to be entered into force in 2021. And that offers a great illustration because it ensures more transparent, traceable, and enforceable set of measures concerning the imports and exports of plastic waste between countries. And that will have a massive effect on the rethinking about plastics and on the consumption and production practices globally. So this is actually, as of 2021, data collection will actually then also start on generation imports and exports of plastics waste under the Basel Convention that I mentioned earlier under target 12.4. On the main component of SciChem, SciChem is very much in its intersessional process. So I'm sure that one of my colleagues who is connected as well may want to kind of add some further information for you in the chat box, and I'm actually happy to also give the link to the legal limits study on single-use plastics. But I think it's very important that it's building on the lessons learned, that it is also looking for the kind of opportunities and synergies, as we are also discussing in this meeting today, whereby actually, you know, the frameworks can reinforce one another, as we were discussing the relationship between the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the Beyond 2020 for the sound chemicals of waste. The kind of pollution angle is coming in as kind of a critical core aspect of sound management of chemicals and waste, but it's at the same time a threat for biodiversity loss as well. And we're all trying to work towards kind of the same sustainable world. So, I mean, key elements are, of course, that it's a voluntary framework and a multi-stakeholder framework. And I think that has been very much appreciated. There's an important role for the private sector here as well. Financing mechanisms and the sustainable financing is a key component that's also being looked at, and not least also a kind of a strong framework to actually really be able to track where we are on the sound management of chemicals and waste. Let me leave it at this for sake of time, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Tessa. I would like to now turn to Ansi. There's a multi-part question on forest and what support can be offered to developing countries who are faced with the challenge of reducing forests, but also needing to maintain certain, let me just read, world certification requirements, where failure to comply reduces international trade of products. So it's covering a few things, but I think including data gaps and challenges that developing countries specifically are facing regarding deforestation. So if you would like to focus on data gaps in the situation that developing countries are facing as they face the challenge of deforestation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Of course, the problem in producing good data for forestry especially is that it is expensive. To be able to understand the status of forest and the trends in forest requires that you do both. You basically collect field information, actually go to the forest, measure the trees, and you can also do field inventory in combination with using remote sensing. The remote sensing, use of remote sensing is very attractive, of course, and use of Earth observation data in general is very attractive because it is cost efficient often. There are plenty of different freely available data sets, just to mention a couple, Lancet and the Sentinel data of the Copernicus program. And these can be used very efficiently in certain parts of the world to, for example, assess whether the forest was cut or not, when we move from high biomass forest to low biomass forest. But then at the same time, we have to be very careful when we use these data sets because they may actually tell a story about something else. When talking, for example, about deforestation, we are talking about conversion of forest to other land use. And cutting trees may happen also in cases where this land use change doesn't happen. So in fact, just looking at satellite data, for example, there may be a forest fire that temporarily reduces the ground cover, but it's not deforestation. So we have to be very careful about this terminology and different land uses. Of course, one thing to reduce deforestation is to use the agricultural land more efficiently. And of course, also to restore forest and to restore agricultural land that is not anymore in a good shape. Those are maybe the efficiency is the key factor, because of course we need to feed the increasing population without destroying more forests.
Thank you very much, Ansi. Lutgard, I'd like to see if you would like to jump in just as a connection to the data question and data gaps from the point of view of SDG 14. If you'd like to add anything to what Ansi has said, as he was coming from SDG 15 perspective.
Yes, I think when the Global Indicator Framework was adopted, there were many, especially in the environmental sector, there were many indicators which didn't have an international standard methodology. and that was in 2016. And the reason why there is a need for an international standard methodology is that the data has to be comparable so that it can be aggregated to the regional and global level also. That said, now we are at a stage where all the SDG indicators have a methodologies, and where the custodian agencies that are responsible to make sure that the data gets reported to the UN SDG Global Database are contacting their focal points in all the countries to collect the data. At the same time, it's also an exciting time because many of the indicators are using, for example, big data, if you want, using the geospatial data. And the good thing is that a lot of the geospatial data is made available for free and is accessible. And that allows also, especially in the context of, for example, water bodies, etc., to also look at an ecosystem like a lake, apart from looking at the lake within a country boundary. So there is a lot of evolution in the way data can be used, and that means that this also means a lot of change for national statistical offices and other offices who work on statistics in different ministries at the national level. So there's an enormous drive also for change that will positively affect the availability of data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lutgaard. Now for the final word for this session, I'd like to turn back to Alexander. And I have a question that is sort of an energizing one. And it says, very good that milestones are included for 2030 and that is where the post-2020 framework is looking for 2030 and 2050. But is it possible to add actionable targets with a shorter perspective, a 2 to 4 year perspective, or to advise governments to set their own targets? And I'm summarizing there, but if Alexander, you could take that. And I would also actually add one more that was directed to you, and that is the role of Indigenous peoples. So it's kind of a 2 parts, but both very much emphasizing the urgency of these questions and the important role of different actors, including Indigenous peoples. So over to you, Alexander, and after you are finished, I will wrap up the session.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to participants for questions. Definitely the whole development of post-2020 global biodiversity framework is informed very much by the sense of urgency. And that's what we are trying to convey to governments, but also to all stakeholders. Whether our parties will be actually interested to do anything shorter than 10 years, I'm not sure in terms of targets. But there are other instruments where there's urgency as well as a faster track actions can be taken. One is definitely the translation of post-2020 global biodiversity framework targets into the national context. First of all, through the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, where governments will be encouraged to do some early actions and to get something done actually much faster than just within 10 years. So another track is definitely commitments. And we very much welcome commitments from both governments, but also from a broader society. So we use for this purpose the action agenda from Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming in preparation for COP15, where we invited already governments and others to make their commitments including to the early implementation of post-2020. And the third instrument to ensure that some actions are made faster basically is within the reporting mechanism. So we will be discussing it at the next meeting of a subsidiary body on implementation, the approaches for reporting mechanism, the reporting for planning. And we believe that reporting instrument will also help not only to push for faster implementation of certain elements of the framework, but also will allow to adjust certain components and actually track where we have maybe lack of implementation and focus on those elements. So that definitely this feeling of urgency again and some faster implementation is incorporated into thinking of the global biodiversity framework and is included through different instruments. So the question on role of indigenous peoples, that's, I would say that CBD as a convention is probably one of pretty unique global instruments outside specific instruments on indigenous peoples, where participated of indigenous peoples, but also of local communities, is actually an institutional part of the convention. We not only have a special element in the article of the convention, but we have a special dedicated process for engagement of indigenous peoples through the entire convention. And also it's important that in the convention it's not siloed in this specific project, which we call Article 8J and related provisions, which actually are legal provisions of the legal text of the Convention on Traditional Knowledge and Recognition of Indigenous Rights. But it's actually a cross-cutting issue going through the entire work of the Convention, as well as one of the cross-cutting issues going through the entire global biodiversity framework. So the role is very high. And the key points there is to help with the capacity development, but also to ensure that engagement of indigenous peoples and also of local communities is a meaningful engagement. And we need to help making this engagement more effective, more productive. And again, in many areas of biodiversity work, we can learn a lot. And also, as Irene mentioned, indigenous peoples are actually custodians for lots of biodiversity resources and genetic resources, as well as in many other areas, including, for example, importance of indigenous lands for development of protected areas or other effective area-based conservation measures. So that's why it's actually the essential component of entire biodiversity work. Thank you. Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Alexander. I think that's an excellent place to leave this session, emphasizing the urgency and the critical role that indigenous peoples have in local communities and the whole range of actors who will be instrumental in making the changes, the transformational changes that we need to make to achieve these 2020 targets within the 2030 agenda. So thank you all. Thank you to all participants and all panelists. I'm sorry we were not able to address all of the questions, but like I said, the chat and the Q&A will be saved and recorded, and we will continue to put in links and answers in a written form in those fields. So thank you again. We're going to have a short break, and we will be back with the next session starting at 2:15, so in about 10 minutes. Thank you all. We'd like to check that our presenters for session 2 are online. Manos, are you online?
I am.
Thank you very much. And Niall, are you on? I don't see Niall yet. Marcelo, are you here? Okay, maybe we'll wait another minute. And Thierry, are you on? Okay. Manos, we'll wait another minute or two for our other
Sure.
panelists to join.
Do you know whether there will be more than 5 minutes as originally exchanged, because you were not sure whether the last two presentations will happen on Goal 17?
Yes, so there will be 5 minutes. 17 will be incorporated to the end. Okay, I see. Arthur, if you could unmute Niall, it seems that as they rejoin, you need to upgrade them again at 2 panelists. So we'll hold on 1 minute.
Yes, I'm here, Stephanie.
Excellent.
Here. Right.
And Marcelo, are you on? Let's see. And Thierry, if you can, are you on? Arthur, maybe go through and see if Thierry Geiger is on.
Yeah, yes, I'm here. No camera though. I cannot turn on my camera.
Okay, Arthur, maybe we can check his settings.
Hold on 1 second. Let me just check your setting from my end. Hold on. It's Thierry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. Just a few more minutes. We're just getting our technical side all sorted. I'll be back in 2 minutes. If Marcelo joins, we'll put his presentation in at the end after Terry. So the next session is yes,
Marcelo, just to confirm that I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we are all set. We will get started. Just because I know that this is such a long session, so I know people are coming and going, I'll just go over a few of the ground rules once again. Attendees, thank you for being part of this. You are able to hear the presentations and ask questions in the chat box and the Q&A field, but you will not be able to unmute your microphone or turn on your camera. That's just to ensure that the session goes as smoothly as possible because we have so many presentations. We are going to be quite strict on time, and I will put up a sign when you have 1 minute left. I don't know if you can read this, and then please wrap up when it becomes to that point in the presentation. And after our 4 presentations, we will have a question and answer period, and we will be taking questions from the chat and Q&A boxes. Also, if there are some questions that we received in advance through the registration, and we'll try to address as many as we can, but we likely will not be able to address them all. And so I do encourage you to keep writing in the chat box. All of that will be saved, and our presenters will be able to answer the questions there, and that will be part of the recording, which will be made available on our website, and we'll be circulating the information about that afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Manos Antoninis, Director of the Global Education Monitoring Report of UNESCO, to take the floor. Manos, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And given that we have only 5 minutes, let's move to the next slide. Simply to say that the Global Education Monitoring Report is an editorial independent team hosted by UNESCO since 2002. And every report every year consists of two parts, a thematic and a monitoring part. And in every monitoring part, we have a chapter to every target. And what I'm presenting is based on our chapters related to target 4.b on scholarships. So the next slide shows the scholarship target. I repeat it, by 2020, substantially expand globally the number of scholarships available to developing countries, in particular LDCs, seeds and African countries, for enrollment in higher education, including vocational training and information communications technology, technical engineering and scientific programs in developed countries and other developed countries. In the monitoring framework, we have a global indicator, that is the volume of aid that goes to scholarships by sector and type of study, and a thematic indicator, because education SDG 4 also has a thematic indicator, a set of thematic indicators that are more detailed, that goes to the heart of the target, which is the number of scholarships, but it has actually now been dropped by the body that is responsible for the framework, the Technical Cooperation Group, because there has not been any information. The next slide tells us a bit about the history of the target. It is a target that actually is not related either to the MDGs or the Rio Agenda. In fact, it is related to the Program of Action for Least Developed Countries in 2010. And it is quite unusual compared to the other 9 SDG 4 targets because it is not universal. It only refers to some countries. And it's not particularly equity-oriented. As this graph shows, post-secondary attendance rates in low and middle-income countries, the orange dots are the poorest, the blue dots are the richest in these countries, and you see that very few of the poor people even ever attend post-secondary education. The next slide tells us a little bit about the population that we're talking about. The left-hand side graph shows the mobility ratio, so how many students of tertiary education are actually studying abroad. You see this thick gray line is actually rather flat with a little bit of a tendency to increase as internationalization of higher education increases, but still we're talking about just about 2% of the global student population. But if you look at specific countries, like on the right-hand side, small island states, in countries like the Seychelles, more students study abroad than in the country, because of course these countries do not have many specialized degrees. The next slide refers to the measurements. As I said, we don't have the number of scholarships, we have the volume of aid, and you see that this is a shortcut. It has its problems. Only some donors report the scholarship aid, many do not, like the United States. And a lot of that aid, more than a third, actually is not allocated to countries, so we don't know exactly who received it. Moreover, we see that it has been constant. In total, about $1.2 to $1.3 billion goes on aid to scholarships. The next slide tells us the more general problems, and I'll mention 2 issues. The first is the concepts. What is a scholarship? The way that the target is defined leaves a lot of question marks. The first is that it talks about available aid for scholarships, not awarded. The second raises questions about the source of scholarships. It's available to developing countries, so it seems to be suggesting that these scholarships should not be originating in developing countries. Then the type of provider. Who should be accountable for the target? Only governments, we assume, but we know that corporations, foundations, NGOs also provide substantial amounts. Recipients of scholarships should be attainable only to in developed and other developed countries. So that seems to exclude scholarships for studying in your own country, even if it comes from abroad, as there are a lot of programs. The use. Scholarships must be for enrollment in higher education, but we know that just as enrollment is important, graduation and return back to the home country are also very important factors. Fees. Some countries have argued they don't give scholarships, but what they do is that they don't charge fees to foreign students. Should their contribution to the target not count? And other issues related to the duration and the size of scholarship that is not covered. So a lot of gaps. The next slide is the first of 2 recommendations that we need. This target needs a redefinition and a refinement so that we know what scholarships count towards the goal. A narrow definition, as it currently looks like, excludes many scholarships. But that doesn't mean, of course, that we should not monitor other scholarships, but we should be very specific about which scholarships count towards the target. The second issue is the measurement issue. And if we turn the slides, we look at these dimensions. it's not entirely clear whether it's an absolute, how many, or relative, whether the share of students abroad should be actually growing. The problem we have is that there is no scholarship monitoring system that is aligned to the targets. The data are collected, but almost none of the scholarship providers collects information and reports information on equity, whether it is the more marginalized groups that may be benefiting from them. 2 studies have been carried out for the report over the years. The first, for the 2016 edition of the report by the Institute for International Education, counted about 22,500 scholarships awarded in 2015. That was equivalent to 1% of mobile students from developing countries. This year, for the report that we just launched and whose theme was inclusion in education, a study by Education Sub-Saharan Africa and the Bosch Foundation counted 30,000 scholarships for African students, but that included all providers, not just government providers. So to turn to the next slide, the second recommendation is that such a mechanism of monitoring scholarships would need to be introduced if this target is to continue, because otherwise we don't know what is happening. The UNESCO Institute for Statistics discussed a proposal with the International Institute for International Education Project Atlas, which brings together the 25 largest national level mobility data collection agencies to encourage them to also collect information on scholarships. But such a mechanism requires funding, and no such funding should be provided. Even if such funding were to be provided, all indicators should be disaggregated by a range of characteristics currently not available, by country of origin of the beneficiary, by sex, by field of study, level of study, whether it is master's or doctorates, whether students study on site or distance. And that's very important in the current context of the COVID-19, which is going to slash mobility rates, and of course the country of study. Last slide, the conclusion and the final points related to the questions in this webinar. What is the current status of the target? Well, it is unknown in the sense that the global indicator on scholarships is very partial. So it does not provide us with enough information on what is going on globally. And there are considerable data gaps, as I just described. In terms of obstacles and opportunities, I think my message was clear. There is a need to refine the definition because currently there are a lot of gaps in our understanding of what counts and what should not count. Interlinkages with other goals, very few, unfortunately. As I mentioned, it's not a universal target and it's not equity oriented, only in a very narrow sense. So that needs addressing. And plans to accelerate action, last point, next program of action for the least developed countries is expected in 2021. Until that takes place, we don't know exactly how chips are going to be continuing in the next decade of action and whether it will continue to 2030. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manos, for giving us a large amount of information in a short time. I really appreciate it, especially the points about the data gaps and the need to clarify the definitions. So obviously there's a lot of work to do here, and I'm sure questions will come, and that will from our audience, and we'll be sharing them with you at the end of the session. I'd now like to move on to Mr. Niall O'Higgins, Senior Youth Employment Research Specialist from ILO, and he'll be talking about Target 8.6. Niall, you have the floor.
Okay, good afternoon. Well, good evening if you are in Europe, or good morning, mostly for those in Japan and in other parts. I'm Neil O'Higgins, and I'm Senior Economist in the ILO's Analysis Unit. Target 8.6, by 2020, substantially reduce the proportion of youth not in employment, education, or training. That is, young people who are neither studying nor working. The answer to the question, will Target 8.6 to substantially reduce the proportion of young people who are not in employment, education, or training by 2020 be reached, is clearly no. Even before the onset of the pandemic-induced economic crisis, the ILO had estimated that the global need rate would actually have increased from 21.7% of young people in 2015, when the target was established, to 22.4% in 2020. Clearly now the pandemic is making things worse. Only in one region, Europe and Central Asia, did need rates fall slightly from 14.8% to 14.6% between 2015 and 2020. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Over the longer term, that is, since records started to be collected since 2005, structural NEET rates have tended to fall due to higher educational participation and in some countries increased labor force participation. And many countries are now introducing national youth employment strategies, something my colleague Marcelo will talk about shortly. So, challenges. Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated economic crisis is the key immediate challenge. This has hit young people particularly hard. They're concentrated in jobs and sectors more likely to be affected by lockdown measures. They're also facing interruptions to education and training. And moreover, young people entering the labour market now and in the coming months will find it even harder than normal to get a foothold in the jobs market, even harder than it typically is. A second important challenge, which existed before the current economic crisis, but which has only been made worse by it, is of course the disparity between young men and young women. Young women are twice as likely to be NEET as young men. Again, however, the long-run trend thus far has been towards a slow redressing of this imbalance. Not so long ago, there were 3 young female NEETs to every 1 young man. So things are gradually improving in that respect. In terms of opportunities, there is clear recognition among countries of the importance of enhancing the opportunities available to young people. After all, young people are our future, and there are some good examples of how to go about it. The Youth Guarantee in the European Union is a prime example. On July the 1st, as it happens, this was relaunched in a new format with a broader age focus, young people up to 29, and with a greater focus on green jobs as well as on outreach, because one of the problems that the Youth Guarantee and in general programs to promote youth employment is that it tends to concentrate on those young people closest to the labour market and tends to leave out those people who really need a greater, let's say, who are further away from the labour market and therefore need more structured interventions to get them back into work. More generally, but along these lines, the ILO is promoting country implementation of large-scale coordinated and targeted action, strengthening youth employment policies, as well as investments in education and training. And there are many examples of partnerships aimed at doing just that. For example, the ILO CEDA partnership on employment, as well as the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth, which has a number of initiatives as part of its general partnership, involves a large number of partners, including, of course, the ILO. But I think my colleague Marcelo will talk a little more about national youth employment strategies, so I'll basically leave it there. But before doing so, it's true we won't reach the target 8.6 by 2020, but to the question, is it realistic that substantial progress on NEET will be made by 2030? The answer is yes, indeed, given that appropriate action is taken at all levels. Now, in a lot of countries, this is just beginning in terms of countries that are developing youth employment strategies. What needs to happen now is to implement that effectively and on a large scale. So with that, that's all I want to say. I'll pass the floor to Marcelo, perhaps. Took you by surprise.
Yes, thank you so much, Niall. Thank you for giving us the overview and also looking ahead and ending on a bit of an optimistic note. I appreciate that. Now on to, I'd like to introduce Marcelo, who is the Youth Employment Officer at ILO, and he will be speaking on Target 8.B. Marcelo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And thank you, Neil, for introducing me as well. So my name is Marcelo Cuauhtla Segovia. I'm Youth Employment Officer at the ILO here in Geneva. So I'm going to briefly present Target 8.B. By 2020, develop and operationalize a global strategy for youth employment and implement the Global Jobs Pact of the ILO. So just a bit of a background before starting. This is part of Goal 8. And so Target 8.B was created in 2015, but there was no methodology for it, which means that it was a Tier 3 indicator. In 2018, the ILO developed a methodology adopted by the ICLS, the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, in November of that year. which made this target go from a tier 3 to a tier 2 indicator, meaning that it had a clear methodology to collect information. Then in 2019, the ILO conducted a survey with its 187 member states, of which 102 provided replies. And thanks to this, it became a tier 1 indicator, meaning that there is a clear methodology and that there is a regular collection of information. So in our case, it will be every 2 years. Now, this is a very new and unique type of target because it's qualitative nature. So it's not a common labor market indicator. It's not like the employment or the unemployment rate, because it actually measures the existence of a developed and operationalized national strategy for youth employment. Now, this is important as a distinct strategy or as a part of a national employment strategy. This means that a country either has a national employment strategy explicitly targeting young people or a strategy for youth employment as part of another strategy or policy. How is this type of data or survey collection taken as a new approach? So basically, how do we measure it? We asked countries to complete a questionnaire based on the indicator methodology that was approved by the labor statisticians that I just mentioned. Then the questionnaire collects information on youth employment in areas such as macroeconomic policies, education and training, labor law and legislation, enterprise development, labor demand, and labor market policies. But also, and this is very important as well, we asked for evidence on the implementation of these strategies. We know that many public policy, pieces of public policies are formulated, adopted, but they're sometimes not implemented. So we wanted to go beyond the simple formulation of documents or strategies and look into the actual implementation. Now, how do we do that? We asked for data such as progress reports, impact reports, budgetary allocations, things that could actually show to what extent the strategies have been implemented. So where are we now? Our data shows that countries are prioritizing youth employment in their policy making. That's a fact. Almost 1/3 of the countries that replied, so about 30 countries, have formulated and operationalized youth employment strategies. Most of these countries are high income countries or middle high income countries. Then about 1/4 of the countries with data available are in the progress and in the process of developing a strategy. Now, overall, in about 90% of the countries with data, there is a youth employment strategy plan to develop a clear strategy in the next 2 years. So this shows that countries are willing to invest in youth employment. Now, to answer the question on whether or not we will achieve the target 8.B in 2020, I am afraid that the answer is no. And COVID-19 obviously is not helping. In fact, the reduced fiscal space in countries is current, especially in developing and least developed countries, provides or allows less resource allocation for the implementation of this type of strategies. In addition to this, we are facing a new problem that has not been very common, at least not since the 2008 financial and economic crisis, which is the fact that usual donor countries are also facing domestic fiscal pressure, which is likely to limit their development assistance to the countries that need it the most. Now, in terms of opportunities, the ILO is in the process of renewing its commitment to youth employment by endorsing a follow-up plan of action on youth employment for the period 2020-2030. This new commitment to youth employment comes after the end of the 2012 call for action for youth employment that was after the 2008-2009 crisis. So we have hope that we will actually manage to deliver good results by the end of 2030. And one reason to make us think of this is the partnerships that we have. And Neil has just mentioned the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth. This is a UN wide partnership coordinated by the ILO to scale up investments on youth employment in different areas, such as education and training, youth and agriculture, digital skills, job creation for young people, and so on. So this is, in a nutshell, what I can say about target 8.b. In terms of that, as I mentioned, this is the first time that we collect data and information for this indicator. So we're not really in the position to compare results to a previous year or previous period of time. But hopefully by 2022, we will be able to do that. So thank you very much, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Very informative, and I'm sure there will be questions at the end of the session for you. I'd like to move on now to Mr. Terry Geiger, Senior Economist and Head of the ICT Data and Analytics Division, Telecommunication Development Bureau of ITU, and he'll be talking about target 9.c. Terry, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you to report on the SDG target 9C. As a reminder, and then you have it spelled out on the screen, as a reminder, target 9C sits under goal 9 and aims to significantly increase access to ICT and strive to provide universal and affordable access to the internet in LDCs by 2020. The indicator that was adopted to measure progress toward this target is the share of world population covered by a mobile network. And what you're seeing on the screen now is the evolution in this indicator since 2015 for the world and for LDCs. And you also see the breakdown by technology, so 2G, 3G, and 4G. Of course, this indicator reflects the minimum requirement for ICT access. It only shows the share of population that can potentially use mobile telephony services, but provides no indication as to whether they actually do. So where do we stand today? The ITU estimates that in 2019, 97% of the world population was within reach of a 2G mobile network. This is very close to the 98% mark, above which coverage can be considered as universal. And it is reasonable to assume that sometimes this year, the 98% mark will be actually met. So this is encouraging and must be celebrated. But at the same time, there are some blind spots that subsist, mainly in LDCs, where coverage of 2G is estimated to be around 90%. And 2G, bear in mind, it's narrowband, so not much, not making access to the internet very easy. And precisely, there's only so much you can do with narrowband. And when you look at the broadband technology, 3G and above, the situation is definitely less rosy. 93% of the world population is covered by a 3G signal or 4G signal, but only 80% of the population of LDCs. When it comes to 4G alone, which is the standard today, global coverage is 82% and only 40% in LDCs. This is low, but we noticed since 2015 tremendous progress. Back then, the share of population LDCs that was covered by 4G was 15%. On the next slide, please. In terms of data gaps, we could definitely do with better accuracy and more granularity for this indicator in order to identify the blind spots, the underserved areas where to target investments. And in this context, big data obviously offers big potential. And actually, ITU has been involved in an initiative for big data for measuring the information society. with the view of creating a new generation of statistics that are more granular, more timely, and more accurate. But we certainly have, better data than some of my colleagues mentioned. The challenge of data measurement is arguably less difficult in the context of ICT, at least when it comes to coverage. So where do we go from here? Of course, mobile coverage is a necessary but not sufficient condition towards achieving universal access to the internet, which is another target in the SDGs framework under goal 17. Currently, a little more than half of the world population uses the internet, and the share is only 20% in LDCs. And these stats, so in terms of internet access, bears special significance in the current challenging and unprecedented context. This large digital divide contributes to magnify the adverse impact in terms of economic and society that the pandemic is having on the most vulnerable. So much effort remains to be done to bridge the digital divide and meet the universal internet usage by 2030. And again, it's not about just building reliable and rapid infrastructure. It's also about improving ICT affordability, upgrading digital skills, ensuring content availability and quality, setting the right standards, creating a conducive regulatory framework for competition, for data protection, for cybersecurity, etc. So a lot of investment, a lot of efforts needed in the next decade, but the return on investment promises to be huge, as we know that ICT can accelerate progress on all 17 SDGs. And on the slide, to conclude, you see some of the initiatives that ITU is leading or is involved in. They pretty much span their entire set of goals. And here, you have a few, including digital health for Africa, digital skills for decent jobs, GIGA, which aims to connect every school in the world to the internet, Equals, which is an initiative to bridge the digital gender parity, smart sustainable cities, etc., etc. I'll stop here and hand back to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much. So that concludes our 4 presentations for this session. I would like now to turn to the interactive portion and the question and answer period. And to start, I'm actually going to go back to Terry, so don't go too far, because we have a question from the chat box that says, is true accessibility for persons with disabilities and older persons being measured in the context of your target and ICT availability and access? So Terry,
Yes.
back to you.
Thanks for the question. Indeed, so I mentioned that the data measurement challenge was not as big as in the other field when it comes to measuring the coverage by a mobile network, but that's the kind of the easy part. And indeed, when it comes to actual use of the internet, and let alone by disaggregated by age groups, for example, this is a much bigger challenge. So we do have some evidence through household surveys that the gap is big when it comes to the elderly and the disabled people. We do have some data, but certainly not at a global scale. And this is where we will be targeting our efforts in terms of statistics, is to better understand the nature of the digital divide and go beyond this anecdotal evidence and try to put some hard facts and figures on the state of the digital divide for these population groups.
Thank you very much, Terry. I'd like to now go to a question that we received in advance through the registration form, And it has to do, I'll paraphrase, it has to do with how to assess the role that businesses in the private sector are having in achieving SDGs, and to sort of avoid blue washing or SDG washing, when the businesses are reporting on their progress and their contributions. And I'd like to see if maybe Niall or Marcelo could talk about that in terms of the youth unemployment landscape, and how businesses are, or how we can hold businesses accountable and work in partnership with them. So as the UN system and other partners. So Neil or Marcelo, would you like to take that question?
I can pick up just quickly. I mean, one thing is that we don't, in terms of assessing the situation and assessing the effectiveness of programs, we don't ask businesses, we ask individuals, and so we base on labour force surveys more than on enterprise surveys, and that way, if you like, one is not dealing with, and that's a much better way of getting a real picture of what's going on. How to hold businesses to account? Well, that's a rather larger question, rather different one, and has to do with effective inspection and effective formalization processes. But I think that goes a bit beyond our remit here. But maybe Marcelo wants to add something.
Sure, Neil. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sure, Neil. No, I just wanted to comment on the fact that, well, the ILO is a tripartite organization. Employers organizations are part of our constituents, so we work closely with them every day, and basically we try to find ways in which we can collaborate closer to scale up impacts on youth employment. And I can give a couple of examples. One of them is actually on the partnership that we mentioned earlier, the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth. Basically, this initiative brings together not only UN entities, but also private sector entities. And this is very important because in the end, the private sector is the sector that creates most of the jobs. Now, another example I can give is the work that we do every day in the ILO to ensure that the rights of young people are respected at work. And this is not only during the actual employment period, but even during the education and training period. I can cite the example of apprenticeship training, in which students go to school, usually a vocational education school, and then they have a training in the workplace. And it is very important to make sure that young people are actually given proper training, that the rights are respected, and to avoid, as you say, greenwashing, or in this case, labor washing practices by businesses, by ensuring that young people are actually trained and educated, and they enjoy social security or some sort of remuneration, and they're not only treated as cheap labor. So these are two ways in which we in the ILO are trying to engage the private sector to scale up and resources for youth employment and youth employment outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. I'd like to go to another question that came in through the registration form, and this will be to Manos, and it's generally on the role of education and higher education in achieving the SDGs. So it's a very large question, and I'll think that you can approach it from whatever direction you'd like, drawing from your report and some of the aspects of your presentation that you maybe had to rush through before. And it also included in that question, it says, to make that happen, does the current higher education system need to transform? So if there's anything from your reporting that could speak to that, about the higher education system and ways that it could change and transform to help achieve the 2030 agenda. A difficult question. I know you can.
It's okay, but thankfully this target is with us till 2030, so we have time to think about it and do more about it. I know that at DESA you have the Higher Education Sustainability Initiative, which is a very important angle. But from our perspective, the way we have actually tried to look at this issue is, first of all, to consider a neglected aspect, which is the fact that none of these highly technical sustainable development goals will be achieved without the necessary capacity that essentially only higher education or post-secondary education can help us achieve. In every report, we have a chapter on the relationship between education and other development goals, and that touches at least partly to this question of what sort of programs do we have to train technicians and professionals to deliver the goals. Of course, then there are other aspects, and higher education needs to be inclusive. That's the dimension that we have been looking at in this last report we launched a couple of weeks ago. And we know here that there are a lot of problems, but the first is the general issue around across education, that it's not only about inclusion of one group, because with inclusion we tend to think of people with disabilities. It's about including all population groups at risk of being marginalized and at risk of being excluded from education. And unfortunately, a recent survey showed that only 11% of countries had a comprehensive approach to equity. So that is something that really needs to change, because higher education is not there only to deliver sustainable development in the form of technical aspects, as I described, but also in terms of being inclusive, because inclusion is a pillar of sustainable development.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Manos. And I think that theme of inclusion is an excellent way to wrap up this session. We're right at the 3 o'clock mark, so we would like to conclude this session. I thank all of the participants very much. I thank the attendees who sent in questions in advance and also during the session. Again, everything will be recorded and saved from that chat. So if there are additional resources and links that any of you would like to share, please just add it to the chat, and that will be distributed. The link to the recording and the saved chat will be distributed to all participants after the event. So thank you all very much. Good afternoon, good evening to you all. And in just a couple of minutes, we'll start the next session. Thank you all. Nan Tran, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
I see UA. I saw him earlier. And I want, Arthur, maybe you can see if he's in the attendee category.
Who is this again, Stephanie?
Mr. Lee, UA Lee.
Yeah, he should be part of it. I already entered him a lot earlier, but let me double check.
Okay, excellent. If I ask everyone to please mute yourselves, that would be excellent. Thank you. So please mute. So I get started. I think I know that Mr. Lee has been on, so he'll be joining back into the panelist group in a moment. But because we are keeping a tight schedule here, I'd like to keep the momentum going and move on to session 3, which is talking about road safety and target 3.6. And we have 2 panelists, and then we also have some discussants who may come in afterwards from the floor. So first, I would like to introduce Mr. Nan Tran, Head of Safety and Mobility in Department of Social Determinants of Health in WHO. So Nan, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Am I still on mute? Okay.
No, we can hear you well.
Okay, great, thanks. So thanks for organizing this session, and thanks for inviting me to participate. So let me just go ahead and go straight into the presentation. As you know, target 3.6 is to have by the year 2020 the number of global deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents. This is a tier 1 target in the sense that we have good data for this, and WHO is the custodian along with UNECE for this target. And we report on this target, on the indicator, every 2 to 3 years through the Global Status Report on Road Safety, the last of which was published in 2019, basing on 2016 and 17 data. And I will show some results from that just to give an idea of where we stand. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to mention that this target, 3.6, is also linked to 2 other targets, and namely 11.2, which is to increase access to safe and accessible sustainable transport systems, and thereby improving road safety. And the other one is on the environmental, which is to integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and plans. And so this is an important part of how we are thinking about this particular target, especially moving forward as we think about the next 10 years. Next slide, please. I want to take a moment to mention that the SDG target 3.6 builds on what is known as the Decade of Action, which was launched in 2011, declared in 2011 for the period 2011 and 2020. And this was actually one of the outcomes of the first ministerial conference, which took place in Moscow in 2009, which eventually led to the UN General Assembly resolution calling for this decade. And this was then followed by the ministerial conference in 2015 in Brazil. So there was already a strong momentum and global push for road safety when this target was announced. And there was also some confusion and some speculation around why the target was set for 2020, because the Decade of Action was set for 2011 to 2020. And there was some discussion that perhaps the reason why this target was set for 2020 was because there was confusion about the Decade of Action and the SDG and a desire to align. And so that all that to say that, you know, from the onset, it wasn't, we never thought it was realistic that this target would be achieved in 5 years, and it was always sort of envisioned that it would take at least 15 years to reach this goal. Next slide, please. Just to note that the Decade of Action laid out a global plan, and this plan really focused on 5 areas of work, which were known as the 5 pillars of the Decade of Action. And you can see here, I'm sorry, the images are not so clear, but there are 5 pillars. The first is really focusing on road safety management. The second pillar was really focused on infrastructure, ensuring that roads are safe. The third pillar was really focused on the safety of vehicles. And again, I'm sure Yue and colleagues from UNECE can talk more about this, because this really focuses on the UN conventions and really ensuring that vehicles meet those countries, accede to those conventions, and ensure that vehicles adhere to those standards. Pillar 4 really focuses on safe road users, and this is really about looking at the risk factors, things such as speeding, drink driving, use of protective equipment such as child restraint seats and helmets and so forth. And the 5th pillar was really focused on post-crash response and ensuring access to quality emergency medical services post-crash. Next slide, please. So throughout the last couple of years, last 10 years, I would say, of the Decade of Action, perhaps you can just keep, finish it so that the whole slide finishes. We don't need to do this way. I just wanted to highlight a few things that have come about in the last decade, and in particular the last 5 years since the SDGs have come into place. You can see here that a number of noteworthy achievements have been accomplished. For example, we now have a UN Special Envoy for Road Safety, that's Mr. Jean Todt, whose term was renewed recently. We have a set of voluntary performance targets that basically highlight the actions that need to be adopted by member states in order to achieve the reduction in 50% reduction. We have increased funding, including a trust fund, a UN trust fund, a global road safety facility at the World Bank. There have been a series of ministerial conferences. There are more NGOs. And so I won't go into all of these, but you can see that this decade has actually produced a lot of momentum around food safety. Next slide. I want to just quickly touch upon this. As you can see here, the red line shows the rate of the green line basically shows the number of deaths over the last almost 15, 20 years. And the red line basically shows the rate of death per population, per 100,000 population. And basically the takeaway message is that we haven't been able to reduce the number of deaths significantly, but we have stabilized the number of deaths in the last 10, 15 years. And that, of course, is an okay achievement, but it means that we're not on track to achieving the SDG target of reducing by 50% the rate of deaths. Next slide. This is just for information. While we have observed that the number of deaths per 100,000 population has remained stable, we do see that the number of deaths per 100,000 vehicles, on the other hand, has gone down quite a bit. Next slide, thanks. So let me skip these slides and let me just go to the next one. I just wanted to highlight next one. So in February of this year, there was a ministerial conference in Stockholm, Sweden, to basically look at the achievements of the last 10 years and to think about a way forward. And next slide. Sorry, this slide's fine. As you can see, if you go back to the last slide, and the three main outcomes of this conference really was to extend the commitment to achieving a 50% reduction in road traffic deaths by 2030, really engage at a high level with heads of states, and to really put forward a set of key priorities for the next decade. And if you go to the very last slide on my deck, you'll see that there are some, the next slide, you'll see that here are some of the key, some of the key priorities that have been identified that have come out of the Stockholm meeting, really looking at different aspects. And really, the main point is really about integrating food safety into a broader agenda and to link it to sustainability, to really engage with different actors, including the private sector, and to really make sure that safety is really a part of a value chain rather than just as an intervention. So I'll stop here, and Yue is going to go into more detail about some of the frameworks that they're thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nan. Thank you for sharing a large amount of information in a short amount of time, and we look forward to having all of your slides in the full deck that we'll be sharing on our website with all participants. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Yue Li, Director, Sustainable Transport Division of UNECE, to take the floor and speak again, target 3.6. And please, all other participants, please mute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Thank DESA for organizing this webinar. For the plan to accelerate action and mobilize all stakeholders, UNECE has started several years to find the ways countries can achieve target 3.6 on road safety. From successful experience in Europe, maritime and air transport, UNECE concluded a system concept. Next slide, please. You know that in 1950s, Europe started fast growth of road traffic accidents, and the countries improved different elements of national road safety systems, such as road traffic rules, signs, signals, vehicles, dangerous goods, and the licensing system and the certification system, as guided by the UN conventions. Around 1970, road traffic accidents started to decrease. With further improvement and management of national road safety systems, countries managed and the continuous reduction of road traffic accidents to a low level. A similar system approach was also effectively used in managing safety of maritime and air transport globally. Low and middle income countries experienced the fast growth of road traffic accidents from around the 1990s. Most countries lack the system concept and the use of this concept to identify gaps or missing elements in national road safety systems, and continuously assess effective coordination of all elements within the systems. In improving road safety, many countries have not used the UN conventions, which have been proved effective in Europe, and also maritime and air transport. Next slide, please. At this turning point to the new decade, UNECE Inland Transport Committee formally recommended this system concept to 159 countries as contracting parties to the UN Transport Conventions and the international organizations on 1st April 2020, after extensive discussions at expert and working party levels. The recommendations and the supporting study report are available in the UNECE website. The recommendation gives a comprehensive picture of national road safety systems that can work effectively to prevent accidents, protect people in accidents, and rescue people after accidents, and also let people to learn from accidents. The systems include all necessary elements at a national level and the regulatory support at an international level. UNECE expects this system concept to become the core approach in achieving the target 3.6 to be extended to 2030. It will be used in the efforts for improving road safety in low and middle income countries during the new decade, and also to be used to coordinate the efforts at the national and the international levels for all the stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yue. Very much appreciated, and thank you for staying within the time. We now would like to open the floor, because I know that we have a couple of possible interventions from individuals who are working with close partners. And I think we'll start with, if he is online, with Mr. Avi Silverman, who is the Deputy Director of the FIA Foundation, a very close partner on this target 3.6. And we'd like to hear any reflections from you, Avi, if you're online. I think you are. So over to you.
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I'll be very brief. I know that you've got a very tight schedule. Thanks for the previous presentations and for holding this session at the moment. As the FIA Foundation, we've been supporting many of the initiatives that Nan set out in his slide throughout the decade of action for road safety, including helping to fund the United Nations Trust Fund, and many of the programs that have been running globally throughout the decade of action. We're very keen as the FIA Foundation, long-standing support on safety globally. We're very keen to see the outcomes of the Stockholm ministerial taken forward, particularly the extension of it through 2030. I mean, as Nan pointed out, there is already a 2030 target on road safety within the SDGs on target 11.2 in cities. And we think that it would be very effective to really push forward. We've seen, as Nan pointed out, a plateauing of reduction in death rates globally, but we haven't seen a significant decrease towards a 50% reduction. And whilst the foundations have been built up to 2020, now is really the time over the next decade to be able to deliver on that. The final point I would make is that actually the COVID situation at the moment whilst very challenging, does provide some opportunities, particularly the focus that's going on in terms of walking and cycling in the Building Back Better push that a lot of organisations are looking at, and governments and cities are looking at the moment. And we believe that needs to be encouraged. I mean, it's obviously not something that is guaranteed to happen everywhere, but we think there can be a very strong case made that can be actually in an economic and social benefit to build back better and support initiatives that are going to be protecting vulnerable road users, whilst at the same time making our cities more livable, which also ties obviously into the environmental agendas as well. So with that, we just to have a very strong endorsement that renewed action through to 2030 is a very important very important priority. And we know that there's a resolution going through the UN General Assembly at the moment, and we're working with partners and governments, and we'd like to see an endorsement of a 2030 extension to the target in that resolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avi. Now, I'm not certain if we have our colleague from the Permanent Mission of Russia to the UN. Ivan, are you online? I don't see you. So I think if you aren't, I think I may go right to a question that I see from the audience. And if Mr. Konstantinopoulos comes, you can just jump. Yes? Is that you?
Madam, I am here.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Do you hear me quite well?
Yes, I hear you well. I don't know, is your camera on? Is your camera?
It is.
Okay. Let me see if I see you. Yes, I see you. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, once more. Dear colleagues, from the outset, it is my sincere pleasure to take part in this useful webinar. We would like to thank UNDESA and all the presenters for making it possible. After the presentations just made, it is needless to remind that we are all at a decisive juncture right now. This year we'll see the completion of the first United Nations Decade of Action for Road Safety 2011-2020. So marks the expiration of SDG target 3.6, which sadly was not achieved. The failure, despite some important achievements, was anticipated, and thus in February, the third Global Ministerial Conference on Road Stockholm discussed meaningfully major avenues to address the situation. May I extend our sincere thanks to you for hosting the event and the warm hospitality. Improving safety remains a priority for Russia domestically and internationally. Almost after the landmark 2009 Global Ministerial Conference on Road Safety in Moscow. That is why, following the long-standing practice, as mentioned by Mr. Silverman, we decided to table a draft UNGA resolution on the crucial matter, notwithstanding with logistical difficulties imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The draft was distributed among the UN member states in New York in late March. It is based on time-proven recipes for improving road safety from the previous UNGA texts. More importantly, it is considerably strengthened with sound and bold advice for moving that agenda forward, taken from the most recent Stockholm Declaration. The key novelties in the document include the extension of SDG 3.6 until 2030, as mentioned before by the previous presenters. We'll change the second UN Decade of Action for Road Safety 2021-2030, and convening the first ever dedicated high-level meeting of the UNGA. Such a meeting could take stock of the highs and lows of our previous actions on road safety, assess the global state of the art, and trace the robust roadmap for the 10 years of active engagement in this field to come. Forgive me. Suggest the idea of maintaining the role of the Secretary General Special Envoy on Road Safety and supporting the UN Road Safety. The text also touches upon the use of new technologies for the benefit of our road traffic. Unfortunately, the prevailing circumstances led to the postponement of the planned General Assembly meeting on road safety to an undefined date. However, despite the current challenges, very few delegations felt that we should leave the matter aside for the time being. On the contrary, we were encouraged by the positive feedback from many member states so far, and we are determined to carry the discussions on the draft that now is being finalized. We very much hope that the soonest return of things to normalcy would allow us to adopt this resolution later this year. Colleagues, on all your countries to support this important initiative and very much count on its positive consideration. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and we're again very much happy to participate in the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that important intervention and giving us an update on those very relevant processes. We are running out of time, but I would like to go to the chat box and ask one question that's coming from an audience member. And this is going to Nan. And the question is, does the road safety target apply to pedestrians, including parents and grandparents walking children to school and to bicycle riders? And how are we addressing those deaths as well? So can you speak to that, Nan?
The simple answer is yes. We have a very standard definition for what constitutes a road traffic death. If a pedestrian, be it a grandparent or a parent walking a child, is involved in an incident on the roads, then it's considered a road traffic death, and that would count. So yes, the answer is yes, that the reduction would apply to that category of road user as well.
Excellent. And just on this, on the second part of the question, are there any initiatives maybe that you or EC are taking that address those in particular?
Yes, and in fact, Avi was really alluding to this point earlier in his response. I think one of the things is that we've been trying to do is really promote active mobility, and really to ensure that as part of a safe systems approach to road safety that Uwe has described, that it ensures a diverse mix of transport modes, and this includes obviously private vehicles, bicycles, but also walking and cycling as part of the mix as well. So we really think that it's an important part, and this really links to the other two SDGs that I talked about at the beginning, which is really about ensuring access to mobility, but also addressing the issues that the threats posed by climate change. And so the introduction or increasing active mobility modes of transport, which are better, cleaner, is really part of the long-term thinking about sustainable mobility.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's very useful. Uwe, would you like to add anything as a final word?
Okay, thank you. About that pedestrian, there's for the UN Convention on Road Traffic, there's a limit vehicle speed to 30 kilometers per hour in school zone. So that protect the children and also their parents. And also that's for the for the vehicle regulations agreement is also one of the UN conventions. There are two critical improvements. One is like for the vehicle body shape within 55 kilometers per hour, and then if there's a bump a person, that for sure cannot kill anyone. Another one is the new regulation recently adopted. For all the new vehicles, it's compulsory to have an automatic stop. So when the vehicle can detect a pedestrian on the road near the vehicle will automatically stop. So that's already that's compulsory for the EU in the new coming years. And the other countries will also apply. So that's related to two UN conventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Yue and Nan, and our other discussants who came in after the panelists. This was a very rich session, and I thank you all again for your participation. Since we're running a little behind, we'll move on to the next session. But again, any questions that were not answered and any links or other resources that you would like to share will be saved in that chat and Q&A field on your screen, and we will be circulating it at the end, at the conclusion of the event. So thank you all again, and now we would like to move on to our final substantive session, and I'll just take 2 minutes to reset things and we will get started. Welcome to all who are just joining, and thank you all for all of you who have been with us throughout. We are now in session 4, progress, challenges, and acceleration actions toward achieving SDG 11.B. And we have 2 speakers today for this session, Mr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta, Chief of the New York Liaison Office of UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and Mr. Esteban Leon, who's the head of City Resilience Global Program for UN Habitat. And I would like to pass the floor now to Marco. You have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. And I would like really to thank my colleagues in DESA who have been working extremely hard and tirelessly in order to make this happen, but also the overall HLPF. I'm really grateful for that. And also, I'm very glad also for the opportunity to brief on this important target, 11B. And I'm glad also to do this with my colleague Esteban from UN Habitat, an organization with which we have a very long-standing partnership when it comes to enhance and advance the disaster risk reduction at the local level. I would like to touch upon just a few things. The first one is to highlight the value of 11B, because in fact is one of the milestones of the often invoked coherence, because at the time of the negotiation of the Sendai framework, in targets and indicators, which happened right after the Sendai framework adoption in 2015, while countries were also negotiating the system of target and indicators for the SDGs, there was a strong political will to make sure that what we were measuring under Sendai would be mirrored under the SDGs. And in fact, the negotiating process of the SDG picked up the indicators out of the Sendai framework indicator systems. So there are also other goals, Goal 11 and Goal 13, which share a similar feature. And I think it's extremely important to stress that, because we can clearly see how implementing and monitoring the Sendai framework, we do also support the implementation and the monitoring of the SDGs. And the reason why the importance of 11B is that risk is local by default, whereas hazards may be global or regional or national in their scope. The risk is by definition local. It goes down to the municipality, to the community, to the person, literally, depending on their exposure, vulnerability, and capacity to cope. And the reason why this connection is important is because, as I said, there are other 20 hidden targets in the SDGs, which are all the indicators under target 1.5 and 13.1, which are also built around the same content as 11B, in particular on the adoption of national and local strategies for disaster risk reduction. So whenever we speak about 2020 targets under the SDGs, we need to bear in mind that there are some elements of those who, although they don't have 2020 in the SDG framework, their 2020 is determined by the deadline agreed upon by countries under the Sendai framework. Why these national and local strategies, and in this case the local strategies are for disaster risk reductions are key? Well, simply because they are a fundamental piece of disaster risk governance, which was identified as one of the most fundamental issues to focus on under the Sendai framework. And that's why we have a priority entirely dedicated on strengthening the disaster risk governance, within which then the question of national and local policies and strategies is framed, in addition to target E of the Sendai framework, which is due by 2020, which is the national and the adoption of national and local strategies. What is important also to stress is that these local strategies and national strategies are not really standalone, in the sense that, and this is where the coherence comes back, is really the importance of developing and implementing climate change adaptation policies and plans, as well as the GIS plans in a coherent way. So the development of them and then the implementation is to be taken forward. And the data that you will see in the next slide come from the Sendai Framework Monitor. The Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is managing the Sendai Framework Monitor, which is the system developed to monitor, as the name says, the Sendai framework. And our agency is the custodian when it comes to the data under 11B and the other indicators that I mentioned earlier in relation to goal 1 and goal 13 of the SDGs. Now, as you can immediately see from this slide, we are lagging behind, in the sense that although we are 2020, we have 85 countries that have adopted national disaster risk reduction strategies, and when it comes to the local ones, we have only 55 countries that has at least some local strategies. And the importance of the national strategies is in that the local strategies needs to be developed in line of the national strategies. So you can see how the two things are strongly correlated. Countries are self-assessing themselves around the 10 criteria, and they're scoring themselves. As this graph can easily indicate, there is much more work to be done to reach the target. And it means basically that we have a major gap in governance, and therefore also a major gap when it comes to the foundation to build back better and to recover better, as we need to do, for instance, for COVID. And then in order to help countries, we have been developing already under the YOGO framework, but especially for the period after the adoption of the Sendai framework, a number of tools. For instance, so we can go to the next slide, the scorecard for cities and the series of publications called Words into Action, which has been developed with the participation of governments, NGOs, private sectors, UN system, and etc. Precisely, they were conceived under the negotiation on the Sendai frameworks with the intention of helping practitioners implementing certain specific aspects of the Sendai framework itself. And of course, the question of local application of disaster risk management, the development of strategies, the financing, all of that comes into the picture. So a lot of tools have been developed to assist local governments in assessing the disaster capacities, the resilience, the risk profile, and so on. And it's in this context that I would also like to maybe give the floor to my friend Esteban, so that he can take us through some of the important mechanisms and tools that have been developed. Esteban, over to you.
Thanks, Marco. It's a pleasure. Thanks, Stephanie, as well, and the colleagues in DESA. Well, I mean, the UN Habitat City Resilience Profiling Tool is one of the tools that Marco refers to. And I think it's quite important to mention some things here to contextualize. We are at a point in time where most of the world's population are living in cities. So therefore, we have to consider that that either we plan and build better cities, or we are going to have a catastrophic effects soon in future, as we can see now. I think that the current crisis is one of the examples. So if you go to next slide, please. Basically, what we have done is we developed a methodology in UN Habitat together with the local authorities, and it goes, I will say, it goes beyond disaster risk reduction. It goes, it's a forward-looking, multi-hazard, multi-stakeholder, and multi-sectoral approach that considers the complexities of urban systems and how cities work. So based on that, we start working together with local authorities and identifying and diagnosing and profiling cities and providing concrete recommendations for action. Right? Next, please. The other part that I think is very important to mention is that that this methodology goes in line not only with the SDGs, especially SDG 11, but also, of course, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Agreement for Climate Change, and also the New Urban Agenda. And I think that it's important because we are taking these global agreements further from just an agreement to an action, an implementation, which is key. And the methodology consists in basically two tools. One is the diagnostic tool, and the other is the recommendations for action. And the diagnostic tool has 4 sets. And you can see in the screen there, you have a set 1, which is the city ID, is like a person's passport, basically, providing context. The second set is the stakeholders and local governance. So we do a mapping of stakeholders and who are important in the sense of relevancy for the functionalities of a city or an urban system. The third set is a mapping of hazards. As I said, it's a multi-hazard approach, so we go beyond the natural disasters. We include also economic issues, all type of hazards that could, shocks and stresses that could actually affect the functionality of a city. And the fourth set, which in my view is one of the most important, which is the city elements. So we identify the different elements that constitute the urban systems, and one by one we extract data and information, and based on that data and information we provide a diagnosis that serves for local authorities and stakeholders to take evidence-based decisions. And we have been testing this in many cities with different contexts, and we have been calibrating and perfectionating this methodology that until now has been giving quite good results in decision taking processes, especially now that we see that we are confronting financial restrictions and crisis. And potentially this COVID-19 is going to project into serious socioeconomic impacts. It's important for them to know how to prioritize and what are the main issues that they should start tackling. Next slide, please. So, as I said, as part of the identification and the calibration in cities, we identified some key. And what we did is develop what we call enhancers. And one of the main enhancers is climate change, for example. And we take climate change in a very climate action, with a very climate action approach, I will say. So basically, what are the do's and don'ts, the specific do's and don'ts for either adapt to climate change impacts, or mitigate in cities. And of course, I mean, needless to say that cities are especially, important in what's the fight against climate change effects. So if you want to know more about this methodology or the tool, we have also our website, urbanresilienchub.org, and you're welcome to visit. And any questions you can just ask to me. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Esteban and Marco. I think I'm going to take the floor back now because we are approaching the end of the session, but I wanted to ask a couple of questions that we received from participants in the registration form. So we received them in advance, and I will just ask two questions and start with you, Marco, and then go back to Esteban for the last word. So the first question is about the science policy interface and how to strengthen the role of data and science in policymaking around resilience. So if you could say a few words about that. And then another relevant question is on resources and means of implementation, especially for developing countries, and if there are initiatives or partnerships that your offices and others are undertaking to promote resilience. That would be very helpful. So Marco, over to you for those two final questions.
Thank you, Steph. These are very important one, and in fact goes to the core of the slide that you're seeing. The question of the science and policy interface is a fundamental one, is strongly embedded in the Sendai framework. There's a lot of provisions about it, and is related fundamentally to the priority one of the Sendai frameworks in understanding disaster risk. And basically the purpose, there's been a campaign that our office launched 10 years ago, and then a lot of work have been done with partners across the UN system and beyond, chief partnerships with UN Habitat, as I said, and then now we are moving forward on the next phase of this campaign, which is fundamentally focused on institutionalizing, increase the pace of implementation, strengthening the capacity, which includes understanding better disaster risk, which includes precisely how we can inform better decision making, for instance, when it comes to the adoption of the national and local policies for disaster risk reduction. So there's a lot of work going on to research and modeling. One of the initiatives, for instance, is the graph that has been is being launched by UNDRR. We're working very closely with the science community and other partners. And then the question of financing also is extremely important because we need, in order to institutionalize the disaster risk at the local level, engineer ownership, you do need financial means. And when we look at the overall scenario and panorama for financing for disaster risk reduction, we can clearly see that a lot of focus is still on preparedness and response. And that's good, and that is needed because disasters are many and increasing. But at the same time, we have to increase the focus on financing prevention and disaster risk reduction. Otherwise, the vicious circle doesn't break. And we do know that, especially when it comes to local government, access to financing is a very, very difficult aspect. So the purpose of the next phase of the campaign is precisely to mobilize more resources and partnerships so that many partners can come around the table and bring their expertise that local governments need. And this expertise is not only international community, is the expertise can be engineered on a peer-to-peer basis across different local governments that are doing a great job in managing disaster risk. Esteban, also, I'm sure that you have a lot to say, please.
I go to respond the questions. I think that both questions are extremely relevant. One is definitely the task of the United Nations is to influence policy, right? We have to make sure that nations start aligning into some policies that have this kind of global impacts. So while we are trying to do, we are doing implementation at the local level and making sure that we try to plan safer and better cities for all. At the same time, we have to, at the national level, influence policy that will support those strategies. So that's key. The other point is the financing part. I think we have to think in two areas. One is the increasing the financing for building resilience and disaster risk reduction, which is key. But the other is the part that I mentioned about prioritization and maximization of existing funds. At the moment, cities will maximize already resources that they already have by just knowing where are the specific needs and the easy gains. And I think that that's very important. And yes, I agree with Marco in that one exercise that really showed the importance of this is the Making City Resilience campaign. I mean, we have more than 4,200 cities that signed the campaign. And that means that they are willing and they already passed the part of advocacy, and they are hungry for implementation and making sure that their cities are resilient and we start implementing risk reduction. So the next phase of the Making Cities Resilience campaign is the part of implementation. So that's we are discussing about Making Cities Resilience 2030, because we think that we are entering into the last decade before the SDGs and the Sendai, when we have to make sure that everybody is implementing and trying to achieve what we committed to, and that's extremely relevant. I think that has to be done in that sequence. We have to learn how to maximize our resources in order to achieve these objectives, and at the same time trying to make sure that there is some financing and support for DRR activities and for building resilience. The trend, as I said, the trend is not going to change. Urbanization is happening and will continue happening. And just with population growth, you can see that cities are getting larger and larger, and could be a comfortable place to live or could be a nightmare for all. So it's important for us to start thinking in that perspective. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esteban and Marco, for that very sharp and targeted presentation and for fielding those questions so well. I see that on the slide there's directions for further information, and so we'll make sure that that is also included on our site, and any additional resources also we will make available through the recording of this event. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Stephanie, and also thanks to Esteban and Laurel, my colleague. Great work. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Laurel. And now I would like to move into the final session, the closing session. Thank you all so much for participating, for listening. This has been a long event starting 4 hours ago, but it's very rich and it covers a variety of wide diversity of targets, all of which have incredible urgency and this 2020 maturation date. So we are very grateful for your participation. And I would like to now turn it over to Mr. Shantanu Mukherjee again from DESA, and he will be offering some closing words, including the 3 additional targets that we have not talked about that are also under this 2020 umbrella, and that's 13A, 17.11, and 17.18. So Shantanu, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you. And I guess I should say congratulations to everyone who stayed with us through these 4 hours. I think we'll all agree that this has been an extremely illuminating and enriching discussion in many ways. I have a few final remarks to make, but let me first also address these 3 targets, 13A, 1711, and 1718. So as perhaps some of you know, 13A is the commitment to mobilize 100 billion annually in terms of public finance by developed countries for developing countries to help deal with climate change mitigation. Now, we don't have a report on this yet. There is a biennial report that is prepared by the UNFCCC, and the 2020 report is still under preparation. In fact, our colleagues tell us that parties who wish to submit evidence of mobilization of finance have till 30th October this year. So clearly this report will only be coming out towards the end of this year or early next year in preparation for COP26. What we do know, however, is that in the last few years, there generally has been an increase in the degree of finance available for climate change mitigation. If we consider the combined financial investments in climate change mitigation, there are various estimates that put this at $500 billion or more. A lot of this is investment by the private sector in renewables. But there has also been progress reported in the last biennial report in terms of providing resources towards this 100 billion pledge. In fact, the upper estimate of what has happened in 2016, which is the most recent year for which we have the data, was to the tune of 56 billion. Now, clearly what we are going to see this year is going to be not the most current data available. It takes time to get the information. There will, I expect, be an update, not just in the terms of the 2020 report, which is expected, but sometime later as more current data becomes available. 1711 is a target on which we're not doing well. This was linked closely to the need to diversify the economies of less developed countries. And the target stated that by 2020, there would be an increase in the exports of developing countries and a doubling of share of LDCs in global exports. Now, the share of LDCs in the global merchandise trade was just above 1% in 2018, which is more or less the same level as 10 years ago, and far from doubling this share in 2020. In general, the share of developing countries in global merchandise and service exports has tended to plateau over the last few years. There are a lot of reasons for this, in spite of the fact that the economies in these countries, as well as the rest of the world, has generally been doing quite well. And I think we would probably need another webinar to go into the reasons for this and how it could be countered. 1718 is about increasing capacity building support to developing countries to increase the availability of timely, quality, and disaggregated data. Now, on this, there has been progress, but it is believed to be insufficient to meet this target. A lot of countries have actually made efforts to strengthen their own capacity systems in 2019. In their own, statistical systems. In 2019, 132 countries and territories had national statistical legislation that was following the good principles established by the United Nations Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. Most countries also had a national statistical plan, but a common bottleneck across all of these countries was insufficient funding for full implementation. However, data remains, as we've heard repeatedly in this discussion, a prominent focus of attention by many players. And since these indicators will continue to be tracked beyond 2020, we hope that some of the shortfalls we are seeing will get addressed sooner rather than later. So, colleagues, friends, I would like to conclude this part of my remarks by just pointing out, I said at the beginning of this session that these 21 targets are in a sense a microcosm of the SDGs. And I think that has been abundantly proved by all of your presentations here today. Areas where UN action and multi-stakeholder collaboration is particularly important, ranging all the way from all of the work we do in terms of advocacy or setting norms and standards or focusing implementation along effective pathways or supporting countries through capacity building, the dissemination of technological solutions, making available the most recent scientific knowledge, and helping countries establish robust implementing and monitoring systems. For all of this, we call upon a wide range of stakeholders. It's been a particular pleasure to see so many of you interacting so actively with us today. And even more of a pleasure to be able to make a recording of where we are at the HLPF in 2020 on all of these targets. And as we go back to our day jobs, as it were, to make further progress in these areas of sustainable development, exactly what we need to do, whether we are working with member states in negotiating different ways forward, whether we are working directly with countries, whether we are reaching out through the private sector or civil society components of society. I think the path ahead is only become clearer through the stock taking we have done today. And I thank you all for your engagement and participation in this. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shantanu. And I will just echo Shantanu's closing remarks to say thank you all. Thank you for your participation and your engagement. Thank you for your interventions through the chat and Q&A boxes. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer everything, but like I said, we will continue to work through them and include any resources or links that we can in the recording and in the saved file. And we will be distributing the recording, the PowerPoint, the entire PowerPoint deck, and additional documentation through our website, and we'll circulate that link in the next day or so. So once again, thank you. Good evening. I know it's late for many of you, so thank you for staying with us. Good evening, good afternoon, and stay well. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.